Hey folks, it's Bear Gardner, and I'm not here on my own for a change. So I've managed to rope in some random Canadian who's down below me, who thought he'd come along and help me out talking about a subject that I get asked about a lot. So I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do, but first of all, I'm going to let JKing introduce himself to those of you who, I don't know, don't play cards, don't know who he is. JKing, who on earth are you, and why should anyone pay attention to what you've got to say?
All right, hello guys. We'll start off with that. I'm JKing7. I'm a cards content creator. I YouTube, occasionally stream, and I'm a former competitive player in cards. I've been playing cards tournaments basically since they started, up until quite recently, and I still follow the competitive scene quite closely. And I'm currently casting the active tournaments that are being played out now. So I'd like to think that I have a pretty valid opinion when it comes to cards esports, cards competitive, and what's going on in the meta.
Seems fair. I'd say you're fairly qualified. You're also incredibly humble. I should also point out that JKing is the three-peat cards world champion, and I think barring one other person, the only person who's ever won a cards world championship, which is not nothing. As for myself and why anyone should, give a damn about my opinion, I am not a cards competitive player. I'm a cards content creator. You can probably tell that by all of the stuff that's on the channels you're watching this on. By the way, all of JKing's channels will be down below. Please, if you don't follow him already, why? Go, do so. It's well worth it. He does content that is we branch over. So I started playing cards, not that long ago. I'm much newer to the game, but I think I'm a little bit older to card games in that I've been playing competitive card games for about 3 decades. So I started back with Magic the Gathering, and I've played pretty much any physical card game you can think of, and most of the digital ones. I did make runs when I first started cards, and I can top 100 and get close to competitive qualification, and then I realised I'm just too old to care. So I stopped bothering, and focused on new player content and information for players to kind of help improve their game. So a lot of my content focuses on how new players can get good experiences and also how players can get better at the game, which is sort of what led me to roping JKing into this. So I get asked quite often, and I have a feeling JKing probably does too, about the meta. Endlessly. And I do get it. Metas are a thing in card games, and everybody wants to know what's good and what's bad, and how do you judge it. And I've given so many overly brief answers because it's been via Discord or a quick conversation that I decided maybe it was a good idea to get some qualified heads together and give a more comprehensive answer. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a chat about metas and how they develop, particularly in digital card games, especially ones with competitive scenes. Now, the cards competitive scene underwent some changes. We've both done videos talking about them. I'm sure you can find them. I don't think either of us particularly wants to retread old ground about our opinions on that, beyond the fact that there have been changes in the competitive scene. Some like them, some don't. Qualification has changed. I will give a brief overview of that in a moment. But the key is that in almost any card game, the competitive scene tends to influence the meta to some degree, especially digital card games that have a ladder, especially when decks are open source and public from competitions, which they are. There is this effect whereby a deck will be played in some form to some degree of success and then will suddenly be seen on ladder. What's interesting, though, is I quite often get asked, how come I can take a deck that is taken by a top player to, I don't know, Final 8 in a competitive event, we'll get there in a minute, and not storm up ladder and qualify for the World Championships? And there are a million reasons, and we're going to get into that. We're not going to do that yet. The first thing I'm going to do is explain that it is currently Friday the 25th of April, which means that tomorrow and Sunday we have the newly minted expansion tournament for United Front. So Cards Competitive right now consists of tournaments after each new expansion comes out, and you can qualify either through the ladder or through being top of the in-game tournaments competitive ladder. And then you go to a Swiss round of 32 players, which I'm going to get JKing to talk about more in a bit because that is relevant. And then those 32 players, or however many turn up for the Swiss rounds, because, spoilers, quite often we don't get all 32. In fact, I don't know whether we've ever had all 32 in my memory. And then they get thinned down to the final 8, and at the moment, it is the final 8 that will be live on Cards' Twitch streams tomorrow and Sunday, and you might catch me streaming tomorrow and Sunday evening about those tournaments with some giveaways. That's kind of the way things normally happen on a Cards competitive weekend. Well, that and JKing usually wins something, but since he's casting, no one has to worry about that. But what I am going to do now is I'm going to get JKing to kind of break down how this works so we understand how we get from thousands and thousands of players to 32 players, and then to what you could argue are the 8 most relevant players at any given time. Brackets, I'll be coming back to why that's probably horrendously untrue later, but I get why people think that way. But I'm going to let the guy who's done this a million times let you know how it works. So JKing, over to you and your quick explanation of how Cards tournaments work.
All right, so in the current iteration of Cards tournaments, they're called expansion tournaments, and they're happening every 3 months, and they're supposed to be following a release, a major patch in Cards, so that each one is sort of a big tournament for that current iteration of Cards, that version of Cards, that meta. And how you qualify to these tournaments is they will take the top 12 or top 8 players from the previous seasons at the end of season. So when the season ends, the top players on the leaderboard will be qualified for the upcoming expansion tournament. And I say top 12 or top 8 because that changes based on how many months are being counted. There is a calendar that you can find that will give you the exact information on that. But this version, there was a 2-month period for qualification, so it was the top 12 from 2 months of ladder. That is 24 of the players, and then the other 8 come from the top 8 of the tournament leaderboard in the month before the tournament. So that was the month that just happened. Very competitive, and that's how we saw another 8 players qualify to the top 32. And then in the top 32, it is a Swiss round, so that means that you are going to be given a random opponent, and then when you win or lose in the next round, you will be matched against a random opponent with the same score as you have. So if you lost the first game, you will be matched against someone else who lost their first game, and if you won your first game, you'll be matched against someone who won their first game, and so on and so forth until you go through a certain number of rounds of Swiss, and then the top 8 from that will qualify into the top 8, which we will be seeing on stream in a couple days, or, well, you have already have watched by the time this video comes out, I believe. And importantly, the format for the Swiss round is you bring 3 decks, and you have to win with 2 of them, and that's it. There are no bans. So you just bring 3 decks, win with 2 of them, whereas the top 8 is bring 4 decks, and then your opponent gets to ban 1 of them, and then you have to win with the remaining 3. And I'm sure we'll get into it, but that drastically changes what decks you're going to be bringing to this.
Yep. It's a pretty clean thing. I'll make sure I link some bits and bats down that if you want to go look into this, I think the records are still up there for the Swiss rounds. But yeah, I mean, it's a good summary of the way that it works. Every game that I've ever played has had weird different ones. Occasionally, this one at the moment gets overly complicated for me, but it's fine. It does its thing. And the key point that we're going to do is talk about how that impacts decks. Now, one of the first things that I want to do before we bring up all the shiny stuff and information we've got is I want to give 2 really important shout-outs. So I want to give a big shout-out to Hayes, who you can find on Discord, who does all of the data breakdown and the data mining and provides us with lovely, pretty visual graphics, which will be appearing somewhere over this way as and when we talk about stuff. That isn't my work, that isn't JKing's work, that's all Hayes. He provides those for us pretty much every time we have a tournament, and they are actually immensely useful. I also want to give a huge shout out to Andy Ettit Moves, who is the reason that I have actual names, hopefully accurate ones, for any of the Chinese community players, because I can fit what I know about simplified Chinese writing and translation on the back of a postage stamp, and he's an incredibly friendly human who helps me out. Also, if you're a Chinese player and you like catch this content, but you also like content in Chinese, please do check out some of his written guides and stuff. Like me, he's a big new player advocate and a hugely helpful human being. Also, I think arguably one of the nicest people in the entire game. He's always very friendly. But yeah, so big shout out to those guys for enabling me to have half a chance of doing this. So what is the relevance of all of this to you as a player in the meta, and how would we assess it? So the first thing I want to do is look at what you can learn from a tournament. And usually the first thing you can learn is what are the big decks, the super popular decks at the time. So appearing on screen should be the spread from this season's Swiss Top 32 and the decks that were brought by the individual players as put together by Hayes, which means that me and JKing can talk a little bit about this frankly slightly alarming graphic. When you look at this, I'll let JKing talk a little bit in a minute about his immediate pick from this, but I will say, generally, this is not what I personally tend to look at and think, ooh, this is a nicely settled and broad meta. This is, there are two very long lines, one quite long line, and then we'll get into talking about the other decks. But to give you a summary of what you're seeing on screen, like, the most brought deck is Germany-France mid-range. I want to say something about that before we dig any further, because I've been asked this endlessly on the forums. Is Germany-France mid-range really a mid-range deck? Kind of, in the same way that US Frontline was, in the sense that it is a mid-range deck in that it likes to trade, and can trade through the mid-game, but it does lean quite aggro when it wants to, because of some of the cards that are in it. But I don't believe, personally, and Hayes asked me about how I wanted to refer to this in the charts, I don't believe you can actually qualify it as a true aggro deck, because it trades too well, and that gives it a different view on it. So obviously we see a lot of that deck, we see a lot of Japan-Germany aggro, or Jagro as it's been known in the game for a while, and we see a lot of Soviet-Italy control. These are the three big predominant decks in the Swiss rounds. We'll get into what the top 8 look like later. We'll break this down as we thin it down, but we're going to start with what you see when you come into it. Now, I've kind of given you my quick view on the top 3 decks would be that we have this Germany-France mid-range deck, which is very prevalent at the minute. It is, I've played it, its various variations, is very good. It has a very fast start. It has a good mid-game. It arguably can be kind of outvalued, but only if you've got a lot of removal. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's been a very popular deck, at least early in the season, for climbing on ladder. Germany-Japan aggro just never dies. It just finds a new iteration. It always has done, until such time as certain pivotal cards are removed. In my opinion, it always will do. But, you know, JKing's been around longer than me, and I'm sure he can talk to you about the glorious days of Bicycle Regiment. But there's always been some variety of taking Japan and Germany's potent aggro tools and just going fast. And either you win or you lose, and there's not a lot you can do about it. I think the most controversial of these decks, at least in the general zeitgeist, has been Soviet Italy Control. I've said things on this. I've done a video on why I actually think this is the less good of the Soviet Control decks, and I still maintain I'm right, even though no one brought it to the top 32, but my stats tell me I'm right. But it is still an incredibly strong deck. It has a lot of removal. It wants the game to go late. So the top 3 decks, at least ostensibly, we are seeing 3 decks that represent the 3 standard modes of any card game, which on the face of it kind of makes sense. And we'll get into a little bit about how that feels later. But that's my view on the top 3 decks. Now I'm going to let that Canadian guy give you his thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, as you've mentioned, the top dog, Germany, France, mid-range. I'm not that surprised that this was brought by 24 of the 29 players who submitted decks for this tournament, just because that is the most popular deck on ladder, and it's just a very, very safe deck to put into your lineup. You're not taking any risks by putting this into your lineup. There's been no hard counters that have really shown up in the meta as of yet. No one's really popularized any deck that can consistently beat Germany, France. So you might as well just bring it. And again, with the Swiss round format, you don't even have to play it, but it's always just a safe thing to start with, especially because there are no bans. Your opponent can start with any of their 3 decks. Well, what's the safest deck to start with? It's going to be Germany, France. If they have a control deck and an anti-aggro deck and an aggro deck in their lineup, just start with Germany, France, and then go from there forward into the set. Soviet Italy control being this popular also doesn't surprise me, because you and I agree that Soviet Britain is the superior build of Soviet control, but there's not really any popular alternatives to do things with Soviets. So we'll see that a lot of the decks that don't clear past 4 people bringing it, a lot of ones at the top are Britain. There's a lot of Britain decks being brought, but there's just a very, very big variety of British decks that you can choose between. So that's been sort of spread out so it doesn't look as impressive, whereas the Soviet decks are very much concentrated into the singular Soviet Italy control. And that's just because that's what people feel is the best thing you can be doing with Soviets. That's very much true with Japan as well, and very much true with Germany, France. Now, there is an asterisk there in that Germany, I think, does have a lot of alternative ways to play Germany. It's just Germany, France is so monolithic in being considered better that it sort of stifles out other very strong things you can do with Germany. Whereas I think Japan is much more limited in what it's really capable of doing in the meta outside of Jagro. And Soviets is somewhere in the middle there. But everything else falling very much short. And I'm sure we'll get into this later, but there is a few notable decks that I was surprised were as not popular as they were. That was a poor way of wording that, but I didn't expect it to be this one-sided in what 3 decks were brought. I was expecting there to be Germany, France, and then probably 4 lines of similar size before the big drop off into the one of type decks. So I have to say I'm very much surprised, and I think a lot of that is the Jagro. I think Japan is higher, was brought much more than I was expecting to this tournament.
Yeah, I am on record on Discord in various places to my hubris in saying that I was expecting quite a broad tournament. Because there are actually, it's interesting because there are actually a healthy number of decks out there that you can play. And I tend to agree. I think one of the reasons that we don't see them is a lot of them actually are Germany main, but they're just, how do you not bring a deck that's that safe? I do think Germany Japan aggro, or Japan Germany aggro, I should say, is eternally, I think, something that after this long, and I don't know whether you'd agree or not, I think part of it is it's a very comfortable deck for a lot of good players, because in one form or another, it's kind of been around forever.
Yeah, I do think that's very much true. And it's also, if you're a player with either you have a smaller collection or you've just been playing cards for less time, you feel less comfortable on these very decision-heavy control decks, and you don't want to get into a 35-minute mirror against somebody who's been playing competitive cards for 2 years longer than you. Jago's just a very safe deck in that you can sort of just fall back onto like principles that you've just picked up from playing ladder. You don't really have to it doesn't take as much energy out of you to play as well, and this is a rather long tournament, or at least it can be in a Swiss round. So I think Jagro just always has these benefits of just being relatively safe, not in that it can't be countered. There are pretty reasonable ways to get countered, but at the very least, if you lose on Jagro, it rarely feels like, oh, I made a critical mistake, and that's a feeling that a lot of people try to avoid. Whereas if you play like a 45-minute control mirror, it's very easy to, and you lose. It's very easy to think of all of the things you could have done differently. Whereas Jaggro, it's just sort of like, well, I lost because I didn't hit my expansions, or I lost because they had 3 bloody sickles in their opening hand, or like it's sort of takes the weight off of you,
Yeah,
and
I think.
again, it lowers decision fatigue, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think it's very true. I will say, I personally was, I won't say surprised, but it was an interesting one to me to see as heavy a representation of Soviet Italy control in the Swiss rounds, particularly for that reason, because Soviet Italy control can do a lot of things. One of the things it really doesn't do very well is end a match in a reasonable period of time. And especially not if, as you say, your opponent is playing a decent weighty mid-range deck, or God forbid, is running a control deck themselves. So I think, yeah, those top 3 decks kind of sit there, and they are relevant. And again, I will say all of the links, I will link to the folders down below for all of the decks that we talk about, so you can go and see them. Some of them will pop up on screen later, but I'm not going to throw everything out and go through every deck. There are far too many variations, but you can go see them. They're always available, and that can be useful for you. And we'll get to things to be aware of when you're taking one of these decks to ladder a little bit later. But first of all, we're going to run down to, as JKing pointed out earlier, the shorter than both of us expected parts of this graph. And before we get to, like, the truly short ones, I do want to say, and I am supportive of both of us in this, because we have both been on record as saying it, and this is kind of playing it out. There is a deck which, as the expansion launched, everybody lost their collective caca about. And it is nowhere at all on this tournament, and it really hasn't seen a lot of strong play on ladder, and trust me, I've tried, and that is the Britain-Italy air deck. And it really, both of us did call this out, that we felt with the changes to the other allied nations and the way that they could lean into decks that were going to be more proactive, air was not going to be as good an aggro choice as once it was. Because, for me at least, and I'm going to let JKing have a swing at this too, because that's what you're here for, to listen to multiple opinions. But for me, as a fairly experienced, I think this man down here has been known to refer to me as some kind of addict, and he has a fair point. A fairly experienced and relatively competent air pilot, I don't like the current meta because my deck can do a lot of things, but it can't trade worth a damn. And it never could. And it didn't need to, because either I just removed the thing you had on board, or by the time you were able to move it into the front line, you had like 3 HQ defense left and I had 4 bombers. That isn't the case anymore, and that has, I think, had an impact. It's particularly interesting to me, actually, that there is literally 1 air deck here at all, and that particular air deck is very, very different to a classic Britain Air, let's throw CAS, buff bombers, and just rip your opponent's HQ down before they can stop breathing. And I think there's a reason for that. But yeah, I was a bit surprised by that. The second one, because I'll give these off kind of I'm going to pick out the 2 that I am surprised about and then let JKing give his opinions on them. The second one that surprised me is that we did not see more Throp. And my reason for surprising this is quite the opposite. I am unsurprised that we didn't see Brit-Italy Air, because it's, frankly, got some awful matchups right now. I was astounded that we didn't see more 3-op cost brought, because in my playtesting, 3-op cost's pretty good right now if you build it with some extra tech to cover some of the other stuff you're going to hit. It can be a bit slow, but it's got enough HQ defense to give some issues to Soviet Italy control in the mirror, which is not nothing at the moment. And it certainly has a better chance against Germany, France than a lot of other decks. So I was a little bit surprised to see that. I suppose before I do, I'm going to go a third. I know I said 2, but I'm going to go a third because I suppose it needs addressing, and I'm kind of going to go 2 at once. Ramp, because someone's gonna ask, because we have seen so much ramp for so long, and we still do see a fair amount on ladder at times. I wasn't massively shocked not to see tons of ramp here, because ramps suffered a few very slowing nerfs and changes, and I personally felt that they were just going to be enough to make ramp maybe viable on ladder, but not the kind of comfortable chair you want to sit in at a tournament. Just becomes a little bit more high risk at the moment to play ramp, and that's my personal view, but I'm going to give you over to the expert to talk about the same deal. And guess if you want to get extemporaneous, please do, but those are the three decks that I wanted to address as the ones that people are probably surprised weren't represented.
Yeah, I'm going to quickly give my thoughts on those three decks and then mention a couple other things that sort of stuck out to me that I was expecting. So starting off with the air, and particularly Brit Italy air, I agree that I don't think it's a particularly great deck. Most crucially, Italy Ally does not bring in any of the tempo cards that fight for the board early. And that's like the one thing Britain doesn't really have since the Shark nerf is a British card that helps them fight for the board early, especially if they go second and you can't just play turn one Swordfish, turn two Buffet, and start clearing things out. And those cards are the air superiorities. Those cards are the claim the skies. US ally can sometimes just get around that by playing War Machine, and then you do more stuff earlier than your opponent. But Italy just doesn't have that. So Italy ally, if you go first and your opponent doesn't have a great start to answer your board immediately, you snowball incredibly quickly and win. But if you go second, or your opponent just like has a tempo play to remove something early, you just have no comeback tools until you have like 7-8 credits to drop a few things and play Regia, and that's just, you can't expect to live to turn 8 if you can't stick a unit on the board after turn 2. So that's just where where Britain Italy air is. I actually expected people to bring it though, because you do just sometimes snowball with it, and people have shown, generally speaking, a high predilection towards picking decks with very aggressive high roll potential and bringing them to tournament, because they see the times that they win, and they see that it doesn't matter what their opponent has. Sometimes their deck is just going to win regardless of what their opponent is playing. And that is a freeing experience if you're playing in a Swiss round where there's no bans and you're going to be playing against a bunch of different opponents with a bunch of different decks, and you're stuck in your head about like matchups and whatnot. It's really easy to just bring a deck where it's like, well, either I do what I want to do, or I don't draw the cards that let me do what I want to do and I lose. So I actually was kind of expecting there to be a lot of air, and I was expecting it to lean more Soviet ally, but I was expecting a fair amount of Italy ally. And the Throp, I was actually not expecting there to be Throp at all. Well, I knew there was going to be one Throp because I talked to Berto and helped Berto prepare for this tournament, so I knew Berto was bringing Throp. And I'm not surprised that it landed at about 3. But this is actually kind of what I was expecting from it. I just expected there to be a lot more popular decks, so it looks lower down on the graph of list of decks. But that's because I think there's 2 ways you can build Throp right now. One is you build it as a bit more of an engine deck, leaning very heavily into the 1k units to cycle very quickly through your deck with Le Terrible, or to get a lot of heal out with the Moroccans, and just essentially playing like a control deck with a weird engine in there, and then just winning off of cycling through your deck and, you know, having card advantage over your opponent. You play a couple bombers, and I think that deck, that's the version Berto builds, and I really like that deck. I think that deck is a tier 2 control deck that is just as valid to bring as other tier 2 control decks like the Brit-Germany controls of the world or the Japan-Italy controls of the world. I think it's an entirely valid deck. The other way to build Throp is you just throw in the Cyclone divisions, you throw in the mass deployments, you just make the deck incredibly heavy, and it drastically reduces the deck's win rate against anything aggressive or tempo-oriented. But it drastically increases the win rate into anything control, because you're just going to outvalue your opponent to a ludicrous extent that they really can only win by trying to race you down, or if they are able to attack your hand size and you're not really able to draw through your deck. Those are like sort of the two ways control can win. And that is the version of the deck that is far more popular on ladder, and that is the version of the deck that I don't think is particularly good because we are not in a control meta. If you look at the top two decks, the top two most popular decks, those are incredibly aggressive decks. And then the third deck, Soviet Italy Control, is by far the best control deck into beating a heavy Throp deck because of the value that you can generate from front formation. So I don't think those are two bad matchups and then like a 50-50 matchup for heavy Throp, which is why I don't think Throp's particularly good. And we'll get to that. But Throp appears to be doing a resurgence, and we'll talk about that more a bit later, I'm sure. But the other thing I want to bring up, though, is I'm very surprised by the lack of Britain-Germany control. It shows up here as 3. And this is an interesting deck where I think a lot of players this deck might not have been incredibly on their radar. I'm sure it's a deck that if you've played in Field Marshal, you'll seen a couple times. But from who I've seen play in this deck and from the conversations I've had, from the conversations I have seen people talking about the meta in the month leading up to this tournament, I thought Britain-Germany control was going to be the third most popular deck after Germany, France, and Soviet Italy, but before Jagro. I thought it was going to be everyone brings Soviet Italy, everybody brings Germany, France, and then they decide between Jagro or Britain-German control or Britain-Soviet air. That was sort of like where my head was at as what I thought like sort of the most competitive players would bring as like the archetypal lineup to this event. And I mean, we do see a few different British decks there, but overwhelmingly the most experienced players swung towards bringing Jagro over any of the British decks, and I find that very interesting. And I wonder if part of that is the fear of these very heavy anti-control decks that are very popular on ladder, and we ended up not being represented at all in this tournament. Particularly, we see only 3 US-France Throps. 2 of those, I believe, are the very heavy version of the deck. We see 1 Japan-France Mill, which is like an anti-control pocket pick. And I think players might have just honestly been scared and just went, well, Jagro's fine. Like, it's a bad matchup into Soviet Italy control, but that's one deck. Everything else is good, and, I can just also not bring it if I don't want to. But yeah, I was genuinely shocked by the lack of Britain-German control and the complete lack of Britain-Soviet air. That seems just to be a deck that everyone collectively forgets about every other tournament. It's really funny. I swear we're on a cycle of one person brings it, they win the tournament, everybody brings it, and then nobody brings it, and then one person brings it and they win the tournament. Like, I mean, the Britain-German air deck, though, is a deck that I'm not too surprised to see people bringing. I know this is a deck that a lot of people have been talking about in the Chinese community. I've been asked by a bunch of different people my thoughts on this build of the deck, and it's a build of the deck that I'm not particularly familiar with. I haven't played around with it a whole lot. I haven't seen it a whole lot, but I was aware that this was a deck being spoken about a lot. So it is interesting to me that that deck even ended up more popular than the Britain-German control, which is a deck that I've put a lot of reps in because I was expecting it to be much more of a mainstay in the meta.
Yeah, I do tend to think you as expected, very nail on the head. I think it is fascinating, and then we get, as we drift into what I consider to be, in some ways, kind of the most fascinating / weird part of this whole thing for me, which is this little lagging tail of one-of random decks that are there. But also, before we kind of breeze past it, a shout out to Commandos for making it in here out of like nerf hell into a position whereby I know it can be reasonable at the minute, but I am not gonna lie, I did not expect to see like 4 people bring a Commandos deck to this tournament.
This Commandos is something that just like really it's been like the last like 2 weeks where I went from seeing no Commandos to like, oh, that player was playing Commandos, and oh, that player was rather experienced. They were testing out Commandos. That's interesting. And yeah, suddenly there's 4 of it here. From what I've seen, I've not been too impressed by the build of the deck. I think the one shining star for Commandos is that it's very, very good into Jagro at the moment, just because Jagro doesn't really have great ways of dealing with commandos. So if you're able to just like, play a commando on turn 2 and then War Machine and then get 2 more commandos on turn 4 and like a cup of tea out, you've probably just won the game. Like as soon as like unless your opponent has desperate measures into on the ascent, and not even everybody's running on the ascent, it's very easy to just stick a couple of commandos specifically against Jagro, and if you're able to do that, the game's essentially just over. You just play out cards in your hand, and it removes the board that they create every turn. But that's one matchup. But hey, Jagro ended up being the second most popular deck, so it worked out for them, obviously.
I mean, apparently so. I will say, if you are one of those people playing Commandos, I've got a lot of respect for you, if nothing else, because every time you come across a Soviet control deck, you must feel like just leaving life. It's interesting because it has, as you say, it is a good match for Jagro. It can be okay in a mid-range match if you get lucky. It's utterly awful into almost any good control deck because they have 600 different ways of just making you regret your decisions in life.
I could see it being very good into Britain-German control because it lacks the sort of the single target removal that Soviet Italy has, so it can be tough to get through all of the boards of commandos with Smokescreen. But that deck did not really end up being popular. And I imagine that you just get bodied by the stats of Throp unless you're able to stick a long-range desert group.
Can confirm this is accurate. I have done a little bit of very recent, like in the last 7 days, testing on commandos, as I, like JKing, was playing through, testing a bunch of things, and then it's like, Soviet Italy control, look, Germany, France, mid-range commandos, yeah, I'll play another 3 or 5, and then it's like, the 2 matches in, it's commandos, then 2 matches after that, it's commandos, and then there was no, and I remember this session because it was kind of commandos break, commando, slightly longer break, and then I had back-to-back commandos, and I was like, what? I need to grab one of these lists to try and understand what's going on, and it's interesting to see that, and then we have this little wagging tail, as I say, of kind of random stuff here. I mean, nobody would have expected to see a Brit-France aggro deck turn up to a tournament. I'm not quite sure. I can't even remember who brought it, but that was a pick that made me raise an eyebrow, and I honestly, when Hayes sent me the data, I had to go digging to try and find the list, because I'm like, what does Brit-France aggro even look like? How is this working? I'm not overly surprised that we saw some mill. I'm honestly a little bit, given the amount of Soviet Italy control out there, and the fact that it can be, as you say, a really good kind of niche counter to control. Mind you, granted, only if you're very good on mill. I was a little surprised not to see maybe a couple more mill decks. And then we see kind of, I personally did, I expected the different control variants because people have just been playing around with a million different control variants at the moment, and they're all kind of decent. And then there's a couple that kind of, well, 2, 3 that stand out at the top as just being stronger. Like US Soviet mid-range, US Japan ramp. Kind of got to ask, have you got any more of a key into where these came out of than I do? Because I really didn't expect to see these.
So, I haven't looked at these particular deck lists, but I've seen a lot of US Soviet Shermans on ladder. Like by far the most popular US deck I have seen on ladder in the last month. Like, it was Throp for a very long time, and Ramp before that. The last month of played ladder, it is US Soviet Shermans. It's just a lot of people playing it, and it's an alright deck. Like, sometimes you just sort of can overwhelm your opponent with just, the constant swarm of Shermans, basically just doing what Throp does, but at a slightly lower curve. And it's a solid deck. I mean, it would not be in one of the top 3 decks that I bring to a tournament. But just the sheer popularity of it that I've seen on ladder, at least personally, it doesn't shock me that one of the 29 players decided to throw it into their lineup. The US-Japan ramp one is a little more out there for me. I've seen Japan ally builds of US ramp in this meta and before this meta. I in fact lost to Takao on US-Japan ramp in Worlds. And it's an interesting ally. Japan brings, most notably, people really like the Heians. Just an ability to close out games quickly if you're able to get that credit advantage. And Japan does offer a lot of very, very good anti-aggro tools right now, which is very, very fun to see with the 77th buff, as well as I think it's the 96th, I forget the name, but the one-cost shock infantry. Just the shock infantries, really, of Japan make them a very, very good ally choice for a slightly off-meta control deck if you want to take things in a slightly different direction, because they are very, very good at dealing with the early game of decks like Jaggro and Germany France. The downside is you're kind of lacking an amazing win condition. And with US Japan, you are lacking effective guards, you are lacking effective healing. So you could potentially just, like, if you get off to a slightly slow start, you could just get raced down before you can really do anything, which is why it is not a tier 1 deck. It's probably not even a tier 2 deck, but, there's some merits to US Japan.
Sure. So I think that gives us a pretty good summary of kind of where we saw the top 32. So what I'm gonna do is we're gonna switch out now, and we're gonna look at the way. So obviously at the end of this, as JKing so carefully and eruditely explained, we end up with the top 8 going through, and it's while obviously their deck submissions will change for the finals. This is also something that is relevant because, as JKing said, we go into a ban format, and we'll cover how that changes things in a minute, and also, in my opinion, why it drifts even further from being more indicative of what might be good for you on ladder. But what we're going to do is we're going to hop and look at a breakdown again from Hayes of the top 8 kind of deck breakdown. Now, the top 8 breakdown is a very different looking graphic because it is much, much shorter and even more dominant. And before we go any further, I am obviously going to point out the most obvious thing on this that everyone will hopefully have seen by now, which is, yes indeed, of the top 8 players, the 8 most successful players in this, all of them brought Germany-France mid-range. Which surprises, as JKing and I have said, mostly no one. It was kind of going to happen. I'm a little bit surprised that it was literally all 8. I expected 6 or 7. Like JKing, I sort of thought there might have been some other Germany builds that might have nudged their way in with maybe 3 or 4 reps in the top 32, and they'd probably still have a good chance because they're good decks. But yeah, it's just like we're gonna. It sits in its own little box. It's just the deck everyone brought, and I'm not gonna pull up all the deck lists. But if you go and look at them, there really aren't a lot of variances in this deck. There are a few little things that you can do that I consider to be like personal playstyle flourishes, but the heart of the deck is very consistent, very easy to kind of wrap your head around. It allows you to pilot in an aggressive early game and then, in effect, kind of tempo through. And if you haven't managed to get the I won't call it high roll because I've said this endlessly, you don't hard mulligan or if you want to win. I'm sure JKing can disagree with me if he wants to, but if you actually want to win consistently on this deck, you don't keep hard mulliganing for the hyper aggro start. What you do is understand that you're going to have a good first 3 turns to get some body, and then either you're going to draw into the hyper aggro and suddenly you just blitz it through and you've won faster than you could possibly have hoped to, or you hit the point whereby suddenly all of your other bits and bats start paying off and the deck just lives long enough into the trading game to win. And I think that's a huge part of where the pilot skill on this deck comes in. But on the whole, I haven't seen any huge variations on it. But as is usual, I'm going to let the expert have a view on this as well. But I mean, that's my read of this big, super representative deck.
Yeah, I mean, it's important when you're looking at stats like, how something like this, where it's what were the decks brought by the players who ended at the top 8, it's important to look at what the decks, like, what percentage of players brought that deck in out of the whole pool, because 24 out of 29 players brought Germany, France. So, that's 8 of the players, the top 8 all having Germany, France isn't like a statistical anomaly. I don't think it necessarily inherently gives any information about the quality of the deck. Obviously, it's a very good deck, but I don't think you can necessarily look at the stat and be like, well, this is why Germany, France needs to be nerfed. Look, it's everybody who brought it top 8 it, or everyone who top 8 it brought it, I should say. But it is just a very versatile deck, and there are some small but significant differences between different builds of Germany, France, which I also think gives it some life. In just, you can build a very different version of Germany, France than what other people are doing, and you're still bringing Germany, France on paper, but it's still like kind of off meta, or it still feels like you're doing your own thing, you're doing something different. There's some decks where it's like you sort of have to bring like a 39 card exact deck list, or at least like 38 cards. And you maybe have 1 or 2 pieces of wiggle room. Germany, France is very much not like that. There's a lot of different cards people have been trying out, like the 4/4 shoots in that fights, the 3/3 blitz infantry that gets +2/+2 if you've dealt damage, obviously combined with the buzz bomb package, which some people run, some people don't run. Some people run Hipper, some people don't run Hipper, some people run Blitzkrieg, some people run a 1 of Phony War, which I've been seeing more and more people run. I'm quite a big fan of the 1 of Phony War tech. As just like a situational hand refill that you're going to pick up sometimes in those games that go a bit longer. There's a lot of variations to Germany, France that when you're just like playing against Germany, France on ladder, you might not really notice. But if you're somebody who's like immersed in like grinding out games over and over and over, you're in practice groups and stuff, these small differences can have pretty substantial impacts on win rates against different decks. Over like an extended period of time. So I do think that there is still a lot of ability to express individuality while still your deck falling under that Germany-France tag in this chart. So I don't think it's nearly as monolithic as this might necessarily make it out to be.
I think that's very fair. I will say definitely go look at those, and if you are looking at those little changes, here's up in the comments. We'll both keep an eye on them and see if we can kind of answer any weird questions that people have about why on earth is this card in there and what's the point of changing to that. There are some really interesting kind of reasons why you might do it in tournaments, and we'll get into tournament teching in a minute after we wrap up these, because that's where we're going to get super noodly. Warning, by the way, which I should have put at the beginning, this might be quite a long video. I might have to put one at the beginning of it because neither of us is known for our short form talking. I'm going to skip Germany-Japan aggro for a minute because I want to tag on to the back end of what JKing was saying, which is there are certain decks that become so established in a particular playstyle and way that you tend to see really not a lot of variation at all. And at the moment, that does tend to lead me into Soviet Italy control, which has become a very solved deck for a lot of people in the meta. Now, clearly, it's worth declaring that we both disagree with the solve because we're both on record as saying we don't think this is actually the best Soviet control build. But it is inarguably a very good one. And I think one of the things that might make it, and again, we'll have different opinions, more popular in a tournament format is I do find in my own play, my cognitive load is substantially lower playing Soviet Italy with decision making and adjusting and needing to understand where I'm at with what's left in my deck than it is playing Soviet Brit. I think they are both very good decks. I just think that one of them requires a little bit over focus, and if you're talking about a big Swiss tournament, that could be very tiring. But I will say, I do think we did see these Soviet Italy control lists be pretty, I'm not going to say generic because they're good lists, but they run some very specific, very good cards that are just really strong control tools. And yes, for everyone who's about to comment down below, like all control decks, or at least the majority of big control decks in this game, they are tremendously elite and special heavy. That's kind of just the way Cards' control cards have always come out. I get asked about budget control decks endlessly, and unfortunately, my response remains the same, which is it's really hard to build a good budget control deck because the really good control tools are the ones that you kind of have in your toolbox and use at the right time, and they tend to be elites and specials. But yeah, so let's get JKing's thoughts on SOE Italy, and we will continue, and we're going to go through, literally at this time, we're going to go through everything represented on this chart because it's a smaller number.
Yeah, so I actually would disagree with you that Soviet Italy is a sort of a solved deck in that, like, everyone's bringing, like, basically the same deck lists. I see a lot of variation in Soviet Italy control. Now, I haven't looked through these 5 Soviet Italy controls in the top 5 decks, card for card, so I can't say that if these players had all 5 had the same exact list, but at least just going off of my experience on ladder, there's a big variation which can swing the win rate quite a lot, because there's some people who don't run any naval engagements, don't run any Dechimas, and are almost like a more burn focused deck, running a lot of blitz units, and they're cutting down some of those Italian cards and just really focused on controlling the early game with the normal cards that Soviet Italy plays, and then just sort of chucking big cards at the opponent's HQ, with front formation as the top end. But then there's like a more like full classic control build where they've got Dechimas, they've got naval engagements, they play just additional board clears and removal on top of what they already play, and those runs are more reliant on front formation for the win. There's some that run SU and mechanized as additional card draw rather than just relying on buy the sword, and obviously that has some upside in that you have more stuff to do early game outside of just fiats and claim the skies. But obviously the downside is you are damaging yourself with the SUs, and those tend to be a bit more on the aggressive side. And then there's some people who have just fully cut the claim the skies package. I think even he didn't end up bringing it, I don't think, to this tournament, but I know Berto's been playing around with the Soviet Italy that just, like, completely cuts all of the air units altogether. There's no Machis, there's no Fiats, there's no Claim the Skies, and it's just a more tank build version of the deck with the 4 attack, heal, Italian infantry. I think there's a lot of different ways to build Soviet Italy control. I think they are all worse than Soviet Britain, and that's where you and I agree.
I will say, I just had a quick look, and this is something that, I have, by the way, for those who are wondering where this conversation's coming from, I fell into the end of this into some content creation, which meant that I've gone into doing some weird auteur deck building, which means that I very, very precipitously left the upper echelons about a week and a half ago, which means there are certain things, one of the reasons this nice man is here, that I haven't seen recently because I plummeted way down to the depths and I'm doing weird things like building tokens and seeing if I can make it work. But I will say, yeah, so the 2 that we are seeing, and you did call them out, the 2 variants we see in this top 8 are, as you say, the classic control naval engagement kind of feel with Ledechma, and then, yeah, there are 2 in here that I've just seen that are the SU variant for the extra draw, which honestly I had not particularly seen that often, but it's an interesting idea. It's and this is why we want to do videos like this, because this is kind of cool to chat about, is where people's heads are at. I'm not, like, Berto, however, very brave human for that build that you're talking about. It's an interesting change, because so many people really believe that air package is almost fundamental to SOE Italy control.
Yeah, just on a personal level, that's the one thing that I just can't really, the main reason I can't really get into Soviet Italy control is I've been playing some in tournament mode, and I had to go down to 2 Claim the Skies just because it was so inconsistent for me. Like, if you hit turn 2 Fiat, turn 3 Claim the Skies attack, that's an incredible start that's going to crush anything, that's going to give you so much healing. And what's great about that is it's not just like, I have like a sudden strike to remove my opponent's early unit. Even if your opponent's like ramping and not doing anything, that's just going to give you such a big buffer on your HQ total that you're going to get so many extra turns with front formation down the line, and that can win you games against these much higher value decks like Throp and stuff. Like, if you get the Fiat Claim the Sky Star, it's insane. But those are 2 limited cards, and Fiat on its own is kind of slow. It's a relatively weak unit. It's worse than 845th. And Claim the Skies on its own is literally an unplayable card.
Yeah,
and
it's a dead draw.
Yeah. So there's so many times where I'll start with turn 2 Fiat, and then, they just remove it. I don't have Claim the Skies. It heals me 2. And then, like, later in the game, I'll draw 2 or 3 Claim the Skies and have no air units. And I just can't play cards. And like, obviously, that doesn't happen enough. There's a reason Soviet Italy is very popular. There's a reason 5 of the players in the top 8 brought it. It's a very good deck, and this is just an element of that sort of, sometimes things are going to work out really, really well. It's sort of like most of the aggro decks are able to do that. Sometimes on Germany, France, you're going to start with turn 1 Dragons and Aunt Frida. Into turn 2 35T, that's just going to happen sometimes, and when that does happen, you win. And obviously, you don't need that to happen to win. The same case for Soviet Italy, but it's just that, like, inconsistency in the early game in a control deck is what I don't love about it. When I play control, I want to be playing control to get away from that sort of do I hit the mulligan type feelings that you get on aggro decks.
Declaration of intent to those of you watching it. There is a reason that we share our opinion on Soviet Britain, because both of us are big fans of consistency. I like JKing, prefer my control decks to be insanely consistent so that I can actually kind of strategize out my turns and my games. But yeah, I think that Soviet Italy's interesting that way. So I suppose let's segue into the other of us. I suppose you'd call them the big 3 in this, but I think we've covered it a bit already, but we can go a little bit more in depth about kind of the value proposition here. We have Germany, Japan aggro, and I will say there is some variation in build at the minute, and there's certainly I find that Germany, Japan aggro's getting into its 40s in a card thing. Like myself, it's beginning to see a little bit of a spread around the middle, and maybe carrying a little more weight than it used to. But I think part of that for me is that people are seeing the value of things like being able to tech in shock units, because I think shock, like we've talked about before, is unbelievably useful against control decks, because control decks tend not to have, like, they don't want to burn all of their tools removing shock units, and shock can give you a good trade, a little bit of an advantage on it. And then we do see representation of some of the heavier bits too. I've personally run into countless variations of... I've played a lot of Japan-Germany aggro on ladder of late, and I'd say it falls into 3 camps. The first of which is people who are staying very classic and going very lean and fast. And honestly, that's probably been the matches I've struggled least to win. Then there are those who have started to like rely on bringing in things like Winter Regiment. I've seen 77th, which I know both you and I are very hot on the sheer value proposition of. That is, if you've not tried 77th, you really should. The value on that unit is insane. Just trust me, it is. And then I see occasionally, like, some of the heavier kind of the 20 Panzergren. Sometimes you see Schutzen and the fighty Schutzen. There's the smack your HQ from a mile away Schutzen and the fighty Schutzen. I've seen both of those make their way into Jagra lists. But yeah, I mean, that's been my experience. And then the third variant, it kind of does the thing that I was surprised not to see more people doing, and it's me being a bit of a surprise partner at this. I do keep running into Japan-France Jagro, which is just like, well, look, the dragons, they're amazing. Shove. And we can get a bit of draw off of the plane, and you can get a bit of draw if you use Hussards well. I'm not sure how good that is. I've played around with it a bit, had some success on it, but I found it quite mid. But I was surprised not to see a little bit more representation of it. But yeah, I think the 2 main ones obviously are the Japan-Germany aggro we're talking about. But I had to throw the mixer in there. But that's kind of been my assessment through the season of kind of seeing Japan, Germany aggro. Wondering whether you've seen anything different, variations that you'd like to call out.
Yeah, I actually think Japan, Germany, aggro. This is very funny to me because, you know, 4 years ago, Jaguar was the most solid deck that ever. Like people were like, there were 8-person tournaments and all 8 people had like the exact card for card Jaguar deck. Like it was the way you built Jaguar. It was just they had 39 good cards and you put them in a deck and played the deck. Um, I think Jaguar right now has the most variation, or at least the most ability for variation out of all of the decks. Like not just like the decks at the top, just like all of the decks. Period. Like I think Germany, France has like 50 cards to pick 40 out of. I think Soviet Italy has like 55, 60 cards to pick 40 out of. I think Japan, Germany, aggro probably has like 80 or 90 cards to pick 40 out of.
Yeah.
It's actually incredible.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think one of the things that definitely I have noticed is particularly that slightly heavier variant. The insane number of different cards you do see in there, and you can't look at I can't look at any of them and just point at it and go, that's a terrible include. Why are you including it? It's just like, I can kind of see why you'd want to try that.
Yeah, it's I part of it is that I think Japan specifically has the best range of like playable limiteds and standards out of all of the nations. In just like you can't run everything. Obviously, you've got the cavalries and you've got the Type 94s, and those ones are kind of the mainstays. But then like you have Yokosuka, and Yokosuka used to be a mainstay, but now people are starting to cut it because they want recons for more draw. Obviously, you have the Type 93s; those are going in there for sure. Obviously, Yokosuka and recon are and Type 94 are not standard and limited. But then the standard and limiteds is you have the Type 92 now that was recently buffed. People are just throwing that in without any smokescreen synergy, but some people are running some smokescreen synergy with Hirosaki. And then you have I think it's the 96th Infantry, the Shock 1-drop. Mm-hmm. That card's incredibly powerful as well. And you have to make some cuts to add these cards to your deck, because if you want to add the 2 new really popular 1-drops, that's 8 cards you have to add to your deck. What are you taking out for that? And then also just Japan and Germany between them have the best like 3 to 5 cost cards in the game, of just like the top end package. So you can run Panzer Grenadiers, and all of these are specials, so all of them you can run 1 or 2 of. If you're running any of them at all, but you can run Panzer Grenadiers, you can run the 4-5 Veteran Schützen, you can run the Winter Regiment, you can run 77th, you can run Blitz Doctrine, which is basically like a 4-drop. And like those are just the ones off the top of my head. And then obviously on top of that, you can run Dragon Slayer and those are stores. You can run some people are running Heian for a bit extra blitz. And then moving away down to more of like the tech cards of like the orders. You can run any number of suppressions with or without cards like Arado or Aichis to help you draw off those suppressions, but some people are just running suppressions with next to no air units just for the sake of 1 credit suppress. You still have Commit the Reserves, which I think is an excellent card in Jagro. The people who are running some of the smokescreen stuff are now getting back to including in Sendai regiments. Maybe it's a bit on the free-to-play side of things, but I've been seeing a fair amount of Command Failure, I believe it's called, the 3-credit destroy a unit with more health than defense. A really good card at taking out guards. It's just Jagro has like a wealth of choices for 1-drops, a wealth of choices for top end, and a wealth of choices for removal. And what's really funny is normally when a deck has that many choices, it's by far and away the best deck in the game. But it's just none of what Jagro has is the best on its own. It just has a lot of really good choices to pick between. So that leads to a lot of variations in the different types of builds. And it leads to it being kind of difficult to counter Jagro, because there's no one thing Jagro does. And I think most notably that is that the very brief rise and fall of Crossfire is Crossfire came out and some people liked it, some people didn't. And as people went back to playing Jagro, Crossfire got more and more popular because it's really, really good at wiping out a Jagro board, and especially getting rid of cards like Aichi that would stick around. But since United Front dropped and Audacity got rotated, people are playing less Aichi, and people are running, and the buff to the Type 92, so people are running the Type 92 now, and they're cutting out a lot of the 1 health units from Japan. And then if you get a Blitz Doctrine off, suddenly Type 90 for the like the TK earlier, Type 94 is a 2/2. Type 93 is a 2/2. And then you just don't play cavalry, and suddenly Crossfire doesn't go off. You cut Yokosukas from your deck, and then you get a Blitz Doctrine off. You have 3 cavalries as the only 1 health units in your deck.
Yeah.
And you just don't play it after a certain point if you're against a German main or ally deck. And then just Crossfire doesn't do anything anymore, because suddenly Jago, all their units have 2 health.
I have painful memories of a very kind of mid-season game that I was in where I was still hovering around sort of the top 400 or so, and I played into a match and I ended up with, I think, 2 or 3 copies of Crossfire in my hand for like 4 turns, and I was playing into a Japan main aggressive list, and I'm like, how is it possible that I cannot find a way to play this card? And as you say, the reason is, in this case, it was because they'd gotten Blitz Doctrine off early, but it's so easy to nullify it, and I think that is interesting, and I agree with you. I think it is definitely one of those decks that lives by the fact that it has 2 nations that have amazingly versatile low to early mid-ish toolkits.
And I also think a big part of the reason Japan is working so well right now is people are stepping away from air. And I honestly don't have a great explanation as to why. But people are stepping away from decks, particularly Soviet. I think Brit-Soviet Air probably is a great matchup into Jagro. And people are leaning into the Soviet Italy build of Soviet control, which it can beat Jagro. But it's not as consistent as you would want it to be if the Jagro is running like 2 Panzergren, 2 Blitz Doctrine. Because suddenly, like, they can just sometimes run you out of cards. And you don't really want to get front formation off, and they just outvalue you with the Blitz Doctrine and the expansions for cheap draw to just keep refilling their hand. Whereas, like, I think if you went with a British ally, just the extra guard units you have would just simply slow down a deck like Jagro with Doctrines off. Enough for you to just be able to play out your big control tools and eventually outvalue them. So I think Jagro's just sort of, I think they're kind of balancing on a knife's edge a little bit in the meta. I don't think that they are standing away like doing crazy things like Germany, France is doing. I don't think they are leading the meta. I think they are very much just balanced perfectly in between the Germany, France's and the Soviet Italy's right now, and just praying that people don't start playing Soviet Britain or Brit-Soviet Air, these types of decks.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I'd say for me, like, Jagro currently is in its most variable and least, I won't say oppressive, but tedium-inducing to play against iteration since I joined the game, because there's just enough there that I have to actually think. A lot of the time, I have played decks like air or control decks, as you know, and I have tended to, whenever I've gone into a Jagro match, not really had to think very hard, because I kind of know what the list's going to be. It's so cool at the minute that I don't. And there are those variations out there. So now we come to the bottom end of our little pile. We've got 4 more to cover. We've got the one-offs, but we've also got, and we both talked about this earlier and had differing opinions. I had expected to see more of it. You hadn't expected it to see at all. Did either of us expect to see 2 Throp decks in the winning part, the top 8 of this Swiss round?
I can't speak for you, but I can certainly say that I did not expect this, and I have a lot to say.
I will say I did expect to see Throp represented. I did not expect, given the meta, to see it. Maybe one player would have a really good kind of Swiss draw. and just squeak in and have a Throp deck on their list. But while I expected to see it represented, I was not expecting to see it represented in the top 8, and certainly not as the fourth deck on the list. But I'm going to let you go first, because I've done a lot of talking so far, and we will discuss Throp, because I know we both are quite opinionated. By the way, warning in advance, we talked about this both during internal testing, before internal testing for the last 2 expansions. We are both kind of big lovers of the idea of Throp, and therefore we tend to be a little bit opinionated.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier when we were breaking down all of the decks, there were 3 people who brought Throp, and 2 of them brought this more heavy mass deployment Cyclone Division version of the deck, and then Birdo brought the more 1K engine-oriented version of the deck, and that's the version that I think is better. And this is where I look very, very foolish, because Birdo is the one of the 3 Throp players who did not make it into the top 8. So the 2 people who brought heavy Throp both qualified into the top 8. But here I want to mention the format in particular. It is 5 rounds of best of 3, and they don't have to play the deck. There are no bans, so they can just play the other 2 decks. And in this case, their other 2 decks both brought Germany-France midrange. One brought Soviet-Italy control. One brought the Soviet-German midrange that we'll get to in a minute below that. So we don't have the data as to if they ever actually played Throp. They could have won their 5 series, or one went 5-0, one went 4-1, I believe. So they could have won, qualified to this top 8 without ever actually having played Throp, because they didn't have the matchups that they wanted to bring it. And that's where that's where a no ban format is very, very interesting, as opposed to a ban format, because you can bring decks that you only play if your opponent has a very specific lineup. So, for example, there was the one Japan-France mill. I know that it was Birdo who brought it, and he brought it because he thought, well, there's a decent chance that one of my opponents is just going to have 3 control decks, like a Soviet-Italy, a Brit-Germany, and then like a Ramp or a Throp or whatever it is, maybe a Germany-Finland or something. And if they have that deck, Japan-France is just a literal free win. Or they might have 2 control decks and an aggro deck, and then they win game 1 on the aggro deck, so they have to win with one of the 2 control decks, and then Japan-France becomes a free win. And if he's ever played against somebody with 2 or 3 aggro decks, he just never picks Japan-France and just plays the other 2 decks. That's something you can do in a no-ban lineup like this, where you don't have to win with all of your decks. So, yes, both heavy Throp players make it into the top 8 is a very significant statistic, but it's important to keep in mind, 1, the sample size on the games are very low, and 2, we don't actually know if they played the deck at all.
Yeah, I did try. I did have a dig to see if I could get any data on it, but it's not kept. I will say, yeah, so the 2 players who brought these were, and they will forgive me if I get the translations wrong. So we have Mule and Accelerator are the 2 players that are brought these lists, and as JKing said, Mule went 5-0. And topped out the top 8. Accelerator went 3-2, and I think was like 6th or 7th. And I do agree that it is very possible, certainly in the case of Mule, it would not surprise me at all, looking at his lists, if he never even dusted off the Throp deck, because that is a thing. But yeah, anyway, carry on. I just wanted to let people know we did try to get the data, it just wasn't there.
Yeah. I bring all of this up just so people don't get too ahead of themselves on the Throp meta. But I don't want to take anything away from these players. Obviously, they brought this they brought this in their lineup for a reason, and if they made it into the top 8, that obviously shows that they're good players, and a lot of thought, even if they didn't play the decks, it still shows that they put a lot of thought into their lineup, and their lineup succeeded where it needed to succeed. And I also want to talk about the actual deck list itself, because obviously I was very critical of the heavy version of Throp in the past, and if you ever watched any of my videos or watched me on stream, I'm very critical of whenever I queue and do heavy Throp on ladder, because I don't think people build it in a particularly sensible way. Their build of heavy Throp is the most reasonable build of heavy Throp that I have seen. They have made a lot of changes to what I might see on ladder, where they just like start throwing in B17s or stuff. And they're running a decent amount of early game. This is not the ladder heavy throb that literally can't be Jaggro. This deck can be Jaggro. Is it favored to Jaggro? I would doubt it. But they have made changes to the deck list, or they have built their deck in a way, I should say, where it's going to be more playable into the more aggressive decks and a more well-rounded deck as a whole. And for that, I think that's actually very cool to see. It's building Throp in a very different way, but in building it in as sensible of a way as possible. And I'm actually interested in, maybe just 2 Cyclones and mass deployment are just the 2. You need to throw those 3 cards in to be able to outvalue Soviet control, and then the rest of the deck can just be the more standard Throp package. I'm not going to go card for card through the decks, but there's some interesting tech choices that I like, and there's some interesting tech choices that I don't like, and then there's some not interesting choices that I don't like. But as a whole, they are doing different things, and obviously whether they played the deck or not, they were rewarded for their lineup. So absolutely not taking anything away from our 2 Throp players.
No, not at all. And I mean, there's not a lot to add. I will say I do find it interesting that Accelerator chose to run the Polish-French Exile. He ran a single copy, I think, of the Grens, and that was an interesting include, and I am aware that some people like that as an anti-aggro tool, because if you can get it on the board, it makes a lot of like board-positioned aggro stuff kind of have to blow itself up to attack anything. I personally, don't know about you, do want to go and actually try playing these lists to see if I can kind of wrap my head around some of the choices, but we're not here to brick through like every thing. If people want, by the way, to see future videos where we do take specific builds or ideas, hit me up on Discord and stuff, reach out in the comments, and I'll see what I can do about what we can do about getting people together to do it, because I've no doubt that both of us would like to do it, but it's also part of having the time and the space to do it. And also, the financial value in doing it. Neither of us, is able to make infinite content, although sometimes it may feel like we do try. But yeah, I think Throt was in an interesting place, and then we get to what, for me, I find the really kind of interesting little... Again, we got this little waggy tail on the end of the list, and we've got these 3 lists that only one person brought, and again, as we've said, we don't know whether these got played or not. I mean, somewhere in this, of all of these 5 decks that we're talking about, one of them presumably might have gotten played somewhere, but in the grand scheme of things, we have the Soviet-German mid-range deck, which I was really fascinated to see. I think this is I've tried making this deck, and I've not been successful in getting it to work as well as I want it to. But I'm really interested to see it trying to find its way, and I think it's kind of cool that we can look at that and look at players. It might be the least bank-breaking of the Soviet decks that you can currently point at as being even remotely playable. But yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting build. Obviously, a big part of it, I think, has taken a hit with the change to 12th Guards, because 12th Guards is so much more fragile now than it was, so that card draw you have to be a lot more careful about using. But it still has that kind of that functional level of being just a value engine as a mid-range deck, which I think is pretty cool. I think, personally, there are a couple of the tech choices in the German half of this that I wasn't wholly convinced about. But, I'm not an expert. He is. But there are a couple of them I'm kind of like, is that really the right tech choice? But props for it being there and making an appearance, because I think it's nice to shine a spotlight on anything, really, right now, that is Soviet main and not control. But anyway, we'll get JKing's thoughts on said list as well.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's not control. this deck is very much like on the borderline between mid-range and control.
All right,
I mean,
fair, but it's
it
listed
doesn't
as
have
mid.
front
Yeah.
formation. Yeah, I mean, once you get cards like 52K, Depths of Winter,
Yeah.
Sky Barons, Crossfire, I feel like you're getting into towards the control end of things. Um, but yeah, as you say, it's very cool to see something that's not Soviet Italy. I like the innovation, and I mean, at the end of the day, Soviets a large part, like there's a huge focus on like what the correct package to go with the obviously the very powerful Soviet cards are. Is that the Claim the Skies and the Fiats? Is that stuff like Stiff Upper Lip and the Glamour Boys? Is that the Blitz Doctrine and Crossfire? There's a lot of talk about that, but at the end of the day, the cards that you throw in with the ally slot can be like absolutely horrendous. Like they can just be the most useless, unplayable cards you've ever seen, and you're still probably going to have about like a 40% win rate, just being hard carried by like the Soviet elites, and like the best Soviet limiteds and specials. And I kind of when I look at this deck, I feel like that's the case where I look at the deck and it's a collection of very good cards. I don't think that this collection of very good cards together is doing anything particularly special or revolutionary or even particularly strong in the meta. I don't think there is anything about these cards together that makes this a first place in the Swiss round 5-0 deck. I don't think that this is revolutionary, and if I were anyone else in this tournament, I wouldn't look at this deck and be like, I need to copy this guy's homework and bring this deck to the top 8. I just think it's a good Soviet deck, and it has the good Soviet cards in it, and if it's piloted well, it can obviously do really well. I'm not taking anything away from this deck, but I don't think that this is like a new tier 1 build of Soviets. I think this is just a different build of Soviets that, got the right draws when he needed to and piloted it well, most likely, and went 5-0 with it. And it's nice to see German ally. I've been trying out a variety of different Soviet German decks in the last few months, so I'm always a big supporter of this type of deck. But I really don't think that this is anything that should be setting off alarm bells in anyone's minds.
No, I don't.
Big impacts on the meta.
Yeah, I don't think either of us is going to say that everybody needs to like leap on this as the next big thing. I think it's just interesting, and I think where it's possibly fair to say that might be true of a number of the decks that we talk about, because that is something that did strike me about this Swiss round, is that we do have quite a lot of representation of what I would consider to be upper tier 2 decks that are just solid, representative. If you're experienced and you know how to pilot, you can get wins. If anyone's wondering, by the way, because I've just realised we do this by reflex, and a lot of my content is for newer players. A lot of pro players, or experienced players like us, will talk about tiers of deck. And generally, we talk about tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 4 does exist, but we'll bypass that for a second. And then there is what I would refer to as, because I'm a dinosaur, the X tier, which is now kind of referred to as S tier decks, which generally represents a deck that top players consider just needs fixing because it's silly. It's that basically there's something fundamentally broken about this deck in the way that it interacts. We have got some good tier 1 decks in this. By tier 1, what we mean is really strong competitive decks. I think the strongest representation of this is definitely the Germany-France mid-range deck is absolutely a tier 1 deck. It's a first-class deck that if you're a good pilot on, you will get a very strong, what we would call an elite win rate, which is usually, depending on how hardline you want to be about it, anywhere north of 60 or 65% is what we'd consider an elite win rate. And a good pilot on Germany-France mid-range will get that, and probably a lot more. Soviet Italy, I think I have to say, even though I don't, as we've talked, we're not going to go on about it, it is still a tier 1 deck. It's a solid tier 1 deck. Germany, Japan aggro, I think we would probably both agree is a tier 1 deck, but barely, in my opinion. I think it's tier 1, but it's the bottom end of tier 1 because it has a ceiling where you really can't do anything more with it and everybody's still fiddling with variation. Tier 2 is where actually the majority of the decks that you're probably playing as a player on ladder and in your experiences sit, which is decks that are really good because you're experienced with them and you know the matchups. But if you took them into, say, an Iron tournament in-game against top players who are playing to compete, you're probably going to find your win rate will plummet just because they are more zeroed in, but we've got some good representation. Tier 3 for me has always been the fun tier, where you're doing something that can get like a 55% win rate and feel like it's fun to play, but realistically isn't going to do anything special. And tier 4 is basically the trash tier decks that can win, but probably are going to struggle to maintain a 50% win rate at best, and that's where you go. Just in case anyone was wondering what on earth we're talking about when we witter on about tiers, that's the TLDR of it all. But I do think it's interesting that we have got these tier 2, these kind of upper tier 2 decks that are definitely favoured enough that really good players, like, I have to be clear, and we mean it when we say, like, we are going to pick nits with everything, because that's what we do. It's how we're built, and I would imagine everybody who's a competitive player watching this would never take offence at it, because that's just what competitive people do. We like to take things apart and pick little tiny things that we change, or witter on endlessly about Brit Ally being better. But what I have to say is, do not doubt that all of the players who made the top 32 and the top 8 are very strong players and very skilled and good deck builders or incredible pilots with a good eye for a deck. And I will say that is the other thing to be aware of. Two different kinds of competitive player. There's the what I consider to be the engineer, the person who builds their own decks and innovates. And then there's just the world-class pilot who has a very good eye for what decks are good to play. I'm not categorizing these players. I don't know enough of them well enough. I think there are 3 players in this entire thing that I think I know well enough to even comment on the way that they work, and they know who they are and they know my opinions. And I'm not saying anything about one of them because one of them is like JKing's best friend. But they do fall into categories. So we saw the Soviet Germany, then we get to this Britain-Germany air deck, and I will say, I think this might be a deck that might be better than the tier 2 that people keep putting it in when it finds its feet, because I do think it has some very good tools, and I think it's just been underrepresented because, like, for whatever reason, and I do agree with JKing, we do seem to have the occasional air blind spot, where, like, if it's not the Brit thing that everybody most recently went insane about, it's not really air. It's like, for a while it was Exile, then it was Brit-Soviet, then Brit-Italy was meant to be it, but wasn't, and we endlessly said, don't jump off the cliff, don't be a lemming, it's probably not actually that good. It's not Empire. It's not Empire. Never mind. But at the same time, sorry, I can't help it. But at the same time, this build, I actually played around with variants on this, and I think it's actually surprisingly good. I just think it has a couple of really arsey matchups at the moment, and that's possibly the thing that's kept people back from bringing more of it to the tournament. What kept people from bringing Brit-Soviet is some kind of cultural blind spot. I think we have to agree on that, because I can't think of another good reason, with Claim the Sky still existing, that you wouldn't think to do more with it. I've tested it a bit early in the season. It's still very good, by the way. But yeah, it's pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, where do you stand on Brit-Germany Air?
So again, I will have to say Brit-Germany Air is sort of like the one deck here that I haven't put particularly many reps in myself. And normally I can have a very good eye for how a deck is going to operate, even if I haven't played it, just because I've played the cards that are in it, in different packages that I've played against it. The Brit Germany Air is the only deck here that I need to test out to have a stronger opinion on. But I think Britain Air is a sort of self-enclosed package that is just always trying to find the best allies cards, like the best collection of ally cards to pair with that package in any given meta. And I think Germany is solidly the second best thing you can be doing with the air package right now. I think first is Soviets, just because I think Claim the Skies is so powerful. Easily the most powerful card outside of Britain for any type of air deck at the moment. And it's just nothing else from anything else can really compare to the power of Claim the Skies at just getting early game control, which is what Air wants, because if Air can get early game control, then just all the British cards are going to help you keep that and eventually propel you to the win. If you're running a fully dedicated Air deck, you can run 4 copies of Suppression. You feel pretty good about yourself, but I've played decks with 4 copies of Suppression, and it's not as good as a lot of people think it's going to be. There's sort of a critical mass of Suppression where it just stops being as good as you want it to be. Like, your opponent plays like the 1 or 2 units that you want to suppress, and then you suppress them. And then after that point, it's basically just like buzz bombs that don't deal damage. And, some matchups you're going to have like 4 units that you want to suppress, but some matches they're not going to have any units that you particularly care about suppressing, and you're essentially just taxing yourself a credit to cycle deeper into your deck, which is fine, but, not the best thing you can be doing. I'm not even like necessarily convinced that I think Germany in my mind is very similar to Japan ally in terms of strength. I think both of those are slightly ahead of US ally right now. Obviously, US ally does have for freedom, but that's kind of the only thing with the constant nerfs to Bomber Mafia. You can't justify running Bomber Mafia in air anymore, and Grey Hounds are just too weak in the current meta, just getting farmed by all of the shock guys. So yeah, I think in my mind, the tier list for ally nations for Britain, air deck, it goes Soviets and then like Germany, Japan together, and then everything else kind of sucks. So it does surprise me that the only air representation we saw in this tournament is German ally. It doesn't surprise me that people brought German ally, and again, this is sort of where we get into different communities within cards. Because there's like the tier 1 meta decks that everybody agrees on. These are the best decks. These are the Soviet Italy controls, the Germany France's, the Jagros. But then you'll have like pockets of people who they test decks together, they share information together, that they will sort of just value a tier 2 deck higher than other groups of people in the community will value a tier 2 deck. Because once you get to tier 2, you're looking at like, it's not going to be abundantly clear that you're hitting an 80% win rate on this deck. You're going to have great win rates into certain matchups, lower win rates into other matchups, and it's much more difficult to get a exact comparison of power level because you're going to have to be balancing a lot of different numbers. And I think this is just a case of the Chinese community, I don't want to say it's very monolithic, but at least a certain contingent, a certain group within the Chinese community really likes German ally air, and they've liked it for months, and they've been talking about it and playing it for months. So again, I don't know these people particularly well, but I have to imagine that the 4 players who brought Brit Germany air to this tournament were from that group, and obviously the one of them who made it here into the top 8 is most likely part of that group as well. So, I mean, I'm all for bringing tier 2 decks. As my favorite thing to do in a tournament is to bring the tier 2 decks to try to counter the tier 1 decks, or at least put yourself into a favorable matchup position into tier 1 decks. And I think you absolutely can do that with German ally.
Yeah, 100%. And it leads us to the last tier 2 deck that appears in this list. And I do think it's an interesting one, and I will say both JKing and I are familiar with the player who brought this deck. He is Maudi, or Ezem Tezem, is a very prominent streamer and a very competitive player and very skilled at what he does. And despite being surprised to see this, I am I'm always happy to see commandos because, you know, I think they are one of the most fun cards to just watch go off on the board. Even if you're at the wrong end of it while Reichsbank still exists, it stops being fun very quickly. But often I find losing to commandos hurts less because it's kind of fun to watch them kind of just popping off shots and things. But this was an interesting one to see for me in it. I'm not going to get into like what happens on the weekend and stuff like that's totally different. We might pop to that at the end of the video, we might not, depends on how much time we've got. But I do think it was interesting to see this, but I personally am curious as to whether the man with the cards brain has an idea. What do you think that Maudi was targeting when he decided to bring? Because in this case, I feel comfortable answer. I was sort of hoping, by the way, that Berto would make the top 8, because then I know you really, really will know the answer. But I know you know him well enough as a player to have some idea of the way he thinks. And I'm curious as to what you think the logic for this as your kind of third, for me, looking at his list, it's his third kind of techie deck choice.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I think the archetypal lineup for this tournament was Soviet Italy control, Germany France mid-range, and then either Jagro or a British deck, being Brit Soviet air or Brit German control. That's sort of in my mind what I thought like the average person would bring to this tournament. And Maudi or Asymptosim, it has the Germany France mid-range, he has the Jagro as what in my mind was the third deck, and has decided to forego Soviet control altogether and bring this Brit USA Commandos deck. And I think that this could come from a couple different motivations. One, just not wanting to bring Soviet Italy control, either being afraid of the anti-control stuff that you see on ladder and you pray that you don't see in tournament, like the Japan-France mill or the heavy Throp, these types of decks. And even just the mirror, because that's the age-old problem with building any type of control deck and bringing it to a tournament, is you're always worried that, like, what if my opponent has the exact same deck as me, but they have, like, you know, one less sudden strike and one more King Tiger. And, you know, that one card difference is, like, a 20% swing in the win rate. And you're always terrified of getting into these just like who built the heavier deck control mirrors. So part of it could just be wanting to not bring Soviet control. But there's a lot of options for Britain that aren't commandos that Maudi could have brought. And I think that probably the deck that this is intended to be targeting is Jagro. Just because, again, Jagro can struggle drastically at being able to remove commandos once they're on the board. And if they can stick on the board, you can just start pinging down all of their units essentially for free while you're doing your other stuff. There's a lot of healing, so you're not really afraid of just taking the 20 damage by like turn 8 and dying. And I think the thing that clearly makes this not trying to target control as hard is the only 2 cup of teas in there. So, you know, you're just sort of accepting that against Soviets, they're going to be sickling down quite a few of your commandos. Obviously can beat control, either if they can stick a long-range desert group to just farm down the high-health units, or just a big pop-off turn with the credit gains into the Rangers and a couple of commandos and just burning them down, because commandos is capable of burning quite a lot relatively quickly later into the game. But, you know, getting there is going to be a bit of an issue. And as a whole, I see this deck as a lower end of the tier 2 decks, where it's like, you look at this deck on paper and it's like, yes, this deck can win games. This deck can beat the tier 1 decks. It can beat the tier 2 decks that other people are bringing. Is it doing any of that at a particularly high win rate? I don't think so. Is it doing any of those at a particularly low win rate? I don't think so, outside of like maybe a couple matches or matchups. I just think that, like, you know, I would personally not bring this deck, and I would personally not recommend anyone else to bring this deck to a tournament, but it doesn't surprise me because the margins you're talking about in a tournament, especially when it's like 5 rounds of best of 3, are so low that it's like, you know, if I brought like a deck that I thought was better here, like if I brought Brit Soviet Air, that might increase my overall win rate by like 5%. And a 5% increase in win rate across 5 games is not going to have like the biggest impact. Like, if we go to the same tournament with that, a 5% higher win rate, there's still a very high chance that the person with the what I would say the weaker deck on paper still qualifies. So I think this is just a case of, you see this all the time in cards tournaments, where you'll just have a deck that's like a kind of out there that does well. And I say that as somebody who has brought my fair share of out there decks. I've brought decks substantially worse than this to tournaments. And some of those tournaments
I didn't want to
some
say
of those
anything.
tournaments I lost. So yeah, I'm definitely not doing this as a question the building of this deck. I think if you're going to build a Brit USA Commandos deck, I think this is a very good way of doing it. I just don't know if I can personally endorse bringing Brit USA Commandos at the moment, but that's just me.
Yeah, and this is part of what's interesting. And Maudi, if you're out there, I'm sure you know very well. And one of the reasons that I picked to zero in on this choice is that we both know you. We both know you're a chill human, and you get the analysis of it. And honestly, I was so happy after having known that he's had some frustrations in trying to hit the competition. So just seeing Maudi make top 8 is very exciting for me. I think that's very cool. And again, these are 8 incredibly good players, and I think it's very important to realise that what we're talking about, and JKing mentions it there, the margins in this level of play are microscopic at times. It can be the littlest thing that makes the difference. And even if it is just that you are way more familiar with a tier 2 deck that nobody else likes, and somehow able to get that focus in, that might be enough to do it. I mean, who knows? It might be crazy enough that someone could, go to a tournament and take some completely and utterly insane infinite cycling Commandos deck that has no reason whatsoever to be brought or even win games and win the whole thing. And if you don't know, I'll find the link. But it's been done, and legitimately, sometimes that can be enough.
I think there is a huge factor in tournaments based on surprise factor, and it's not even necessarily surprise factor that, like, it's not that your opponent, some of the time, like if you're playing like a weird combo deck, it might be they literally don't know how your deck works. But like in the case of like bringing something like Commandos, they're gonna have played against a Commando deck before. They understand how your deck works. But the difference is, when they're playing against Germany, France, they've played against Germany, France like 400 times in the last 2 weeks. They're gonna know that matchup in and out like the back of their hand, and it doesn't matter if that matchup's like technically better. They're going to be able to make the decisions in that game so much more easily. And there's a risk that maybe they sort of slip into habits and don't think through their turns properly and make mistakes because of that. But most of the time, it's just going to conserve their energy a lot. They're going to be able to make decisions more quickly, and they're just going to generally feel more comfortable on every turn. Whereas if you bring a deck like Commandos, it's going to take a lot of players out of their comfort zone. And if you're already a player who's like playing in their first ever tournament, you're already like, the nerves are probably going to be very high. And you're not used to they're feeling like so much pressure is on every single decision you make. And if suddenly you're playing against a deck where you have to be referencing the deck list like in another screen like every 30 seconds, because you're like, wait, do they run 2 of these or 3 of these, or is there this card in their deck, or like what cards could they draw here that could get them out of this situation? It doesn't matter if the deck is like has a 5% lower win rate than the deck you've played against 400 times. The fact that you've not really played against a top player playing this deck before, and you've maybe only seen it once or twice in the last month, could actually more than make up for that 5% lower win rate just on paper, everything included. So there's definitely a value to just like, throwing out a deck into a tournament like that's especially a wide pool tournament like this, where it's just like, I don't have to play it. I could just bring Germany, France, and Jaggro if I feel like my opponent might be more experienced and might just have like a better lineup that's capable of shutting down a sort of out there tier 2 deck. But if I feel like my opponent, maybe doesn't have the best lineup, or is just new in general, or probably doesn't know what to do against commandos, I just have this pocket pick that is just going to be such a boon in really throwing my opponent out of their routine, out of their rhythm. And that in a card game where, it's very easy for two players to play perfectly and then the one who drew better to win. It's a bit of proactivity in trying to throw your opponent off, trying to get your opponent to make mistakes by playing something that they're not comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great summary of where things go. So I'm going to stick with the theme of summarizing, and I'm going to go with the two last pieces of data we've got. These we're not going to go into in great detail because I'm not saying they have no value, but I know people will be interested to see them, and links to all the stuff down below. I'll make sure there's a Google Doc where you can access all of the nice stuff that Hayes has done for us. But what's popping up on screen at the minute is of the 32 player, well, it's 29, because as I say, quite regularly, all 32 players don't turn up. But of the 29 deck lists, like sets that were brought to the Swiss, what you're seeing over that way is the breakdown of main nations and how many of each main nation were brought. And I'm not going to say that this has no statistical value, because obviously it tells you a little bit about where people feel nations are, but don't leap to assume that this means that Germany is just by far and away gonna win everything all the time just because the majority of people brought it. We've talked about this a bit before. And then we'll pop up the other half of it, which is the exact same breakdown is appearing right about now, hopefully, because I can edit, right? Which will be the allies from the top 32 in the Swiss, are the 29 players, and you can see the breakdown of how many of each allied nation is. And yes, this one I am gonna stop on just a little briefly, because this one does have a much more pronounced divide, in that there are 3 nations that appear as allies, notably. Then there's a nation that some people thought about, and then there's everybody else. Mostly. And I'm going to let JKing kind of hoe forward in a second with his own thoughts on this, but there is a reason that I think this is fractionally more interested than the main nations, because what you have to remember with the main nations is that there are only the 5 main nations. You are bringing 3 decks, so odds are you're going to see a decent representation. Granted, the fact that the US was at the bottom is to do with the fact that US's most sort of archetypical and consistent deck got a bit of a hit, and its best replacement, and I will say this, if you want to play a US main deck, please go check out my video on US France mid-range. Go try it. It will get you to Field Marshal. It will do all of the fun things that you want it to do, but it is painfully overshadowed by the advantage that Germany can take with France ally, and I'm sure JKing's going to talk about that in a minute, because that is also part of the reason that there is this colossal obelisk-like blue line of allied nation chase, followed by a grey line that's only slightly smaller. And it's interesting that it is in allies that we're seeing this incredibly strong representation. But anyway, I'll let the expert give you his opinions, and then I'll come back with some of my own rubbish.
So, I want to start off here mentioning, just sort of reiterating what you were saying about the main nations. It is always very different comparing main nations to minor nations, because in the main nations, you have to bring 3 different decks from 3 different main nations. If there wasn't that restriction, it entirely possible it would look very, very different. And like, even if the restriction was you can't bring the same main nation, minor nation combination, like, there might be Germany, France, and Germany, Britain, and Germany, Finland, or it might be Germany, France, and then like Soviet Italy, Soviet Britain. Like, would have a very big impact, but each player has to bring 3 decks from 3 different main nations. So that's why main nation graphs like these do tend to, they're not to be necessarily any huge outliers. Obviously, we do see USA down at only 5 people bringing it. And I think that's honestly a little sad. I think you can argue that the other 4 nations have a clear tier 1 deck that you can bring, even if people didn't bring it, like in the case of Britain. I think US has a lot of a big variety of tier 2 decks. Like I think there's definitely some things you can be doing with Yank. I think there's some things you can be doing with Sherman's with the Italy ally. And like, are these the best things you could be doing? No. They're not like the first things you think about, but I definitely don't think that this represents just US being unplayable in the meta. You can definitely land top 32 using a US deck. But the ally nations is where things get absolutely crazy. And what's really cool is we actually see every ally nation represented in this tournament. And that's something that we don't often get to see because there are 9 ally nations that you can have in the game. The 5 major ones, obviously, and then France, Italy, Poland, and Finland. And it's very rare that you see all 9 represented because some are just, the minor only nations, France, Italy, Finland, and Poland, usually go through phases of which 1 or 2 are good and which 1 or 2 are kind of unplayable. And then also Soviet ally out of the main nations is the one that typically does not show up ever because Soviet does not bring a lot of good cards in as an ally nation because it relies very heavily on their elites. But we get to see everything represented, but just the absolute dominance of France, Germany, and Italy is insane. And it's not infrequent to see like 2 nations at the very top. Typically, it's been Germany ally and US ally. Germany for the aggro decks and US for the control decks. That's definitely been very pronounced in the last year, with stuff like Production Order and Bomber Mafia and Ramp being like the only way to play control for a while. And then Germany, obviously, for like the 35Ts, and then later like the Blitz Doctrines, stuff like that. Very, very powerful stuff. But what's important is this is the United Front expansion and tournament. So the 24 cards that were added to the game were only for the 4 minor only nations, and they were meant to shake up the meta. So what if you're 1939 looking at this, you're thinking, well, like, we want to see the meta being shaken up, and every nation was brought, but Poland and Finland were each brought once, which is very, very low. That's about where they were being brought before this United Front came out. And then France and Italy are 2 of the 3 most brought nations. Italy not quite being able to make it past Germany, which has been historically the highest, most played ally nation. But just, it shows really the impact United Front has had. And it's definitely something to keep in mind when you're thinking about stuff like balance patches. Maybe France and Italy are performing a little higher than everyone expected. But what I find very funny about this is Italy is not performing this well because of the cards they got in United Front. I don't think there was a single deck in this tournament that ran a single United Front card for Italy. I could be wrong about that, but just thinking off the top of my head, they had the air cards that definitely weren't brought, and they had the deployment twice card, and I don't think that was brought. Like maybe someone has a cheeky Breda in one of their Italy's, but I highly doubt it. Italy is just this high because of the cards Italy had before. France is this high exclusively because of United Front. France is by far and away the winner of United Front in terms of just what they got out of it. And I think that's something that maybe some of us are a little surprised, just how powerful it is. And I think this chart, much more so than any of the other charts we've seen, is the chart where we should look at this and go, maybe there's some changes that need to be done.
Yeah, I can confirm, at least on my best scroll while we're talking, that yes, not a single United Front Italy card that I can find was brought into the top 32. And yeah, I do think this is... I know I called out, in a positive way at the time, to my own detriment at this point, the fact that I thought France had done very, very well from United Front, and that mid-range was going to see a substantial increase in value because of a couple of cards, in particular, we're looking at you, Samoa. But yeah, I was very, very struck by the sheer weight that the top three have here. Just the scary thing is if you add the top three representational numbers together and then add everything else together, and then you realise there was no point, because you could have added everything else together and it goes past Italy, but then it stops. And that's... in fact, no, it comes just short of Italy, which is terrifying. And I do think that France is definitely one of those places that you can look. And this does also, if you're a newer player and you are wondering about kind of the value of cards and stuff like that, it is interesting to note that allied nations are becoming stronger after United Front, which is not a shock. That was kind of the point of United Front. I did a whole video on my views on that. But yeah, I think this is a more indicative list. Germany continues to be Germany, and I will continue to say that Germany just doesn't need nerfing. Germany just needs everyone to stop helping it for a while. Just let it sit while everyone else catches up. But Italy is the weird one for me, because I, like you, was kind of... I will admit, I kind of expected France when I saw the meta start to shake out early season. I was like, okay, so France is going to make a big impact. I am sad that a good US-France deck is not good enough to make it to the tournament, but I get why, because you can just do it better with another nation. But I was not expecting Italy to be quite so... Hey, look at us. Given that Italy's United Front performance was... I think you would let me get away with saying a little bit underwhelming. I wasn't massively sold on the United Front cards. But I am also, I will say, calling out other stuff. Many people, having watched this far, and if you've watched this far, well done, I would say we won't be that much longer, but have you met us? But I will say many people are probably, like, from their own ladder experiences, especially if they've kind of made Field Marshal and just bounced about at the bottom, are like, but where is this deck that I am constantly seeing? Where are the 15 Germany, Finland discard decks? Because it's the only thing I ever see on it. Too long didn't read... or don't want to, it's not that good. And it includes some cards that are objectively terrible. It's just annoying enough that it can win games. But also, it isn't, for me, I wouldn't have picked it in Swiss rounds. Might look different. Spoilers, we might look at them in a minute when we're done with this conversation, because we do finally have the top 8 decks. Might look different when we get to top 8, but when there's no ban on the table and I'm having to go through Swiss rounds, I do not want to play a deck that has the potential to brick me the way that one does. But once again, I'll let JKing give his own thoughts on it, but those are the things that I pick out from this list.
Yeah, I think Germany-Finland is an interesting case of a type of deck that shows up once in a while, where it can have, like, a 70-75% win rate on ladder, but its win rate against the, like, top 32 players is below 50 across the board. And this happens rarely, where it's just a deck that wins so much of its winningness, like its ability to win games, comes out of punishing mistakes from the opponent. And I think Germany-Finland is very heavily into that, where it's very easy to misplay against it. A lot of them just, like, randomly throw in some Finnish countermeasures, which are very easy to lose a game because of, just playing into friendly fire. And, you know, some of them run off-clawing to develop more German countermeasures, and now you need to know all of the countermeasures to properly play around that. And, you know, you might just go all in to the HQ, but you forgot about Alpenfestung, and now they've healed back to 25, but you dumped too many resources in, or maybe you throw out all of the small cards in your hand, forgetting that now that means that they can discard the big cards, expensive cards that you have left in your hand. There's so many ways that Germany, Finland punishes you for being inexperienced that are just not going to happen against a tournament player, and that's just going to make the deck fall off hard in an actual tournament. So it doesn't mean that like you shouldn't play the deck on ladder. Like if you want to do well, you could do very well with the deck on ladder, but it's just not a tournament worthy deck because it relies too heavily on your opponent making mistakes, and you can't bring a deck to a competitive tournament against the best players in the game and expect to win because of exclusively your opponent making mistakes. You just want a deck that's able to win on its own, and then also hopefully you outplay your opponent. But you can't rely on that. But going just back to the Allied nations, I think Finland has a lot more power than is represented on this graph. I think in particular, I've seen Introduction has a Japan-Finland shock deck, where it's sort of like a slightly slower Jagro deck, maybe it's a Japan-Finland mid-range, if you will. And this relies very heavily on shock units. It's incredibly powerful. And like I've not seen anyone other than Introduction play it. As far as I'm aware, he came up with a deck, but I'm sure that is a deck that will proliferate through the community in the coming months and prove to be a relatively popular tier 2 deck. I have no doubt about it. And I think Finland is doing much better than it appears on this chart. Again, the US Italy Shermans, or sorry, that's an Italy ally, not a Finland deck. But I think Finland has some very powerful things it can be doing that people just didn't do in this tournament. Poland, on the other hand, needs help. Soviet as an ally nation needs help. Britain and Japan are doing fine. But what's very interesting about this is Italy shows up third. Italy is obviously it's a very big bar. It's more than everything below it combined. But that is 2 decks. That is Soviet Italy control and Japan Italy control, and they're running basically the exact same Italian cards. So Italy being like this high of a number, being third here, is not really representative of like, oh, Italy has so much they can be doing. Italy really has one good thing they can be doing, and it's just something that both Soviet and Japan want, where Japan control lacks some very effective, it lacks removal and it lacks effective healing, and Italy offers both. And then Soviets, being based around front formation, really wants healing, and it wants more efficient removal. And again, Italy offers both. Where we get into the things that are doing everything a bit too much is Germany and France. Because Germany here, you have the German ally for Jagro, and that's for the 35Ts, that's for the Wirbelwinds, that's for the Blitz Doctrines, that's for the 22nd Infantries, that's for the Suppressions. But then you also have, like, we saw Germany in the Soviet Germany, that's running, like, Crossfires, that's running Sky Barons. And then, of course, we've seen the Britain-Germany control. That's running more, like, again, more Blitz Doctrines is a recurring theme of Blitz Doctrine being very popular here. But you're running stuff like Annihilation, Wolf Pack, so sort of a discard package. And then, of course, the Britain-Germany air decks, where they're running it for suppression, and then a few of their different air units, or that one's sort of all over the place in terms of tech cards that people throw into Brit-Germany air. But Germany is offering a wide variety of cards. They're running control decks, they're being run in aggro decks, they're being run in mid-range decks, and not just like, oh, they have a couple good tech cards, like it might be with Italy. It's, you're running like the win condition of the deck is just Blitz Doctrine in a lot of decks. And then you get up to France, and France is doing mill, control, throp, and Germany-France mid-range. Like France is, and also we saw like the Japan-France aggro and the Britain-France aggro. France is just offering so much effective tier 2, tier 1 strategies across the board that it's stifling out other options. And I'm not saying that like all of those need to be nerfed. In fact, I'm not even necessarily saying any of them need to be nerfed from Samua. But it is just what leads to these situations isn't just Germany, France. Like, you can't look at this and say it's just Germany, France, because that is ignoring the Soviet France control, the US France Throp decks. That's ignoring the Japan France mill decks. There is a lot more than just the size of the line. It's also the cards, the number of different cards from these decks or from these nations that are being offered that are being run. Because again, Italy, it's like the 12 good Italian cards are represented in this line, and that's it. Whereas Germany and France are really showing a wide variety of different strategies that are creating a wide variety of tier 1 decks, or tier 2 decks as well.
Yep, absolutely. I think I can't add much more to it because I think we are, as occasionally it has been known to happen, of the same mind on where this particularly sits. So, assuming that I get things to tidy up or have the time to do it myself or can convince Hayes to do it for me, if you did do it for me in the future, thank you, future Hayes. I want to talk very briefly about the information that we have now gotten on what happens next. Because what happens next is we move on to a Final 8 where bans are a thing. If you're not familiar with what a ban is, these are open list tournaments, which means you see your opponent's lists ahead of time. In the finals, you get the opportunity to pick one of your opponent's decks and say, you cannot play that deck. Just no. You can't have it, bye. Now, this can be, and this is where if you're just wanting to check out and just check out the meta and do that, there'll be timestamps down below. You can skip to the summary at the end and just ignore this section entirely. if listening to two long-toothed old competitive players talk about tournament formats isn't your thing, you probably should do, unless you find our voices particularly soothing. But this is where we get to the part where I have often said, when someone has asked me, what deck should I be looking at? Look to the earlier parts of qualification. When it gets to the finals, these decks have a lot less to do with ladder value than anything we've seen before, because now we're into the mind games of tournaments and wanting to know that your lineup can eat a ban and still be likely to give you the chance to come out with the wins. So we have seen, and I'm just going with the list as I can see it in front of me, it will probably be in a different order on the screen, but hopefully it'll be close to. So we have 6 Soviet Italy control lists. We have 6 US France Throp lists. We've got 5 Japan Germany aggro lists. And then we have, what's the last one? Unsurprisingly, it'll be at the top of the thing, I'm sure. We also have 6 Germany-France lists, which I should have done at the top, but we kind of knew were going to be there. But then we kind of stop, because once again, we get into tail territory, because then after that, we have some 2-ofs. We've got a couple of Brit-Germany Air. We've got a couple of Brit-US Ramp reappearing. We'll talk about that in a minute as to where that fits into a more tournament format, and I think JKing touched on it earlier about how useful it can be in a control form. We've got Germany-Finland turning up a couple of times. It did appear. And then we've got the 3 one-ofs, one of which I'm going to leave till last because it interests me, but we've got a Soviet-German control list, which is just an interesting control variant. Note, I haven't seen all of these lists in any detail because I didn't have time before recording. I've only glanced at them. I'm relying on JKing's information because he did the text parsing for me here. We get a US-Italy ramp list, which I was not expecting. And we get a Japan-Soviet covert list, which just blew my mind when I saw it. But so these are what we're seeing in the top 8, and obviously now we start to see people changing their thinking about how their decks go. And before we get into the decks and this and the decks and that, I'm going to start with going to the guy who's done this a million times before and going, so for those the uninitiated out there, why on earth would it be such a Wild West change just because we're going to add a ban in? Why does that make such a big difference?
So adding a ban is very, very massive, because if you have a weak deck, into your opponent's lineup and there's no ban, you just don't play that deck. And you might be losing out in the information that your opponent now knows that you're going to be playing the two decks that aren't very bad into their lineup. So it's almost like they got a ban in that they banned the deck that was very bad into them, or that was very bad into them, because that's the deck you're not going to be playing. Now that there is an actual ban, if you get into that same situation where you have two decks that are fine into them and a deck that's very bad into them, they're going to ban one of the decks that are fine into them, and now you have to win with the deck that's bad into them, and if you can't, you lose and you are eliminated, and you are not collecting the first place prize. That's what all of these players are out to get. So as soon as a ban is introduced, your lineup becomes as good as your worst deck, because you have to win with everything. You have to win with every single deck that your opponent doesn't ban, and you have to naturally assume your opponent is going to ban the deck that is best into their lineup. So because of that, people are going to take, generally speaking, people take less risk, but there is also an element of, if you can bring a deck that is wild enough and scary enough, that sometimes it will just bait out a ban, because a lot of people will just want to play comfort matchups. So if you bring 3 decks that they were expected to see, and then like a weird combo deck, there's a pretty high chance that they just ban the weird combo deck, because they're like, I don't know how to play against that. Now I don't want to have to like read the deck lists a lot. I don't want to have to run practice matches between series. I'm just going to ban that out of the way. The risk of doing that, of course, is you play against someone who looks at your deck and says, you know what, this deck looks bad, and I'm not going to ban it. And now suddenly you have a bad deck. And that's why there is, the 6 Soviet Italy's, the 6 Germany France, the 6 Throb. We'll get to that in a second. And the 5 Jagro is, most players are bringing the sort of the safe decks, the decks that they're like, I'm not going to get like hard counter. Maybe there's going to be 1 or 2 bad matchups, but you're bringing 4 decks, your opponent's bringing 4 decks. And it's very difficult to have a 4-deck lineup where all 4 of them are heavily favored into one of your decks. That's what we call a counter matchup, and it is very hard to pull off successfully. And nobody appears to have really tried that here in this tournament. So they're all just sort of bringing like what they think are, generally speaking, the 4 best decks. And that greatly benefits the people who brought weird decks. Because the issue with bringing a weird deck is like sometimes you bring a weird deck and then your opponent just playing 4 control decks, and your weird deck can't be control, and now you can't win. But everybody's doing a little bit of everything, and so that's going to give everybody at least a chance with all of their decks on paper across the board. And we do see important are not just the ban, but also we are bringing in another deck, and all the decks have to be a different main nation. And we saw previously sort of the top 3 main nations, Germany, Soviet, and Japan, being much more represented than Britain and US. Now you have to bring a 4th deck. And we see that it is Britain here that it seems to be drawing the short stick for most people. People choosing to bring US over Britain is actually very, very surprising to me. In fact, US hops from the least brought main nation in both the players who made it into the top 8, as well as the players more broadly in the Swiss round, to actually 7th, or 7 out of 8 players bringing US into the top 8, placing it just below Germany and tied with Soviets, but above Japan and Britain, which is incredible. And I'm sure we will talk about that in a few minutes.
We might just. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And this has always been the part that kind of got me my reputation, I suppose, back in the old days, about talking to people about tournament mentality and the psychological side of it. It's why there's a whole set of stuff on my channel about the mind games and top play, and some people enjoy it, some people don't. If you do, go watch it, it's fine. But this is where you start to see the psychology, and I agree, JKing's evaluation is very on point, which surprises no one. I think we've landed in a place where people are like, okay, we really need to zero in here. But there are a couple of people who have chosen to do something just a little off the wall. Now, I'm going to pick one person for one reason and one reason only, and that's because he happened to go 5-0 Should say they, I think it's he. Forgive me if it's not Mule. But Mule went 5-0 in the Swiss, topped out at the top of the thing, and we looked at the lists, and Mule is bringing, for me, what I consider to be the most... what I would say is a fishing deck. I think this deck is fishing for a ban, because he's bringing this Japan-Soviet covert list. Now, there are a lot of reasons at the moment that having some covert cards can be problematic. The single biggest one goes back to a point that JKing just made, which is that Britain got the short end of the stick. That means we're not seeing piles of bombers, and Brit air decks, traditionally, make covert players wish they didn't play the game, because the hardest counter to covert is anything that can flip your card without triggering a response. I'm fascinated by the logic of this list, because it's not a true covert list. It's got some covert cards in it, but it's got just enough other bits of high value stuff, like the 58th Infantry that we've talked about before, like obviously they bringing Anne. Interestingly, not bringing bring the classic removal rather, and bringing some other bits of kind of almost Japan control / board presence tools. And then bringing this kind of Soviet covert package, including, and I did not think I would be saying this in this tournament, four copies of Covert Operation, which will appear over that way. Cards will keep popping. But yeah, I don't know whether it's the same for you, but outside of seeing 6 Throp decks, and you're right, we're going to come back to that in a minute, this was the thing that made me, like, blink twice and go, is this just ban fishing, or do you think this deck is more dangerous than it looks?
I think there was a lot of value in Covert as a archetype in countering decks that rely heavily on orders for removal, and particularly on AoEs. And in this case, we are looking at Soviet Italy. I think that Covert is just a very, very good strategy into Soviet Italy, and I mean, we saw there's 4 Soviet Italy players, and one of the 2 people who don't have Soviet Italy is the player bringing the Covert deck, so that means 6 out of his 7 possible opponents have Soviet Italy control, and maybe that is the deck that he's trying to counter here with Covert. That would be my best guess, because I have to imagine that Covert is just far, far too slow against Jaggro. It's far, far too slow against Germany, France, and I don't think that a deck like Throp, which is apparently the other popular deck here, I think Throp is going to be able to be playing enough units that you're not going to snowball hard enough, and this deck in general doesn't seem to be running like the full in snowball, like away with the game style that that sort of the Soviet main covert deck has, because a lot of the fully snowball cards are a bit more Soviet. The Japanese covert cards are a bit more sort of one in. So I don't think that things are going to get too out of hand against a Throp deck. Maybe you just get like a really big separate BTN, and that could just like one-shot the opponent. But, you know, Throp's going to be doing its own thing. So at the end of the day, I think that's really the only like matchup that I would consider good, just on paper, again, not having played this deck, would be the Soviet Italy, but it's a matchup that everybody's brought. So that when you see a matchup like that, the first thing to ask yourself is, well, like, okay, do his other 3 decks also beat Soviet Italy? Is this a counter lineup for Soviet Italy that a lot of people brought? But then you look at his other decks, and there's Germany, France, and like Germany, France is probably the best deck in the game right now, a lot of people think. I think Soviet Italy, one of the strengths of Soviet Italy is that I think it goes toe-to-toe with Germany, France in the mirror, or in that matchup. And then there's the Throp, and, you know, Throp absolutely can beat it can beat out Soviet Italy, but this version of Throp is a bit less heavy than the other players were bringing, which is heaviness is what you want against Soviet Italy. And then the last deck is Soviet Germany control, which I definitely have some big question marks as to how good that's going to be into Soviet Italy. So I don't really think that this is a full-on Soviet Italy counter matchup, but at the very least, he's probably not going to be banning Soviet Italy, and is going to be praying that he gets that covert deck into Soviet Italy.
Yeah, it does feel like a fairly strong one. So let's hit the elephant before we both go crazy not hitting the elephant. So we are seeing 6 Throp decks, and as far as I can tell, of the 6 that we're seeing, all but one are running the Cyclone Division style package. And I'm at a glance, so I will stand corrected when I'm wrong on some of this. But this legitimately not what I expected at all. I'm not quite sure what's happened here, but I'm with you. I am not convinced that this is the best Throp build out there from my testing, but there's got to be something going on, and it seems to have caught a light with these players.
Yeah, so this is something that happens from time to time. This has definitely happened before in the past, where people take the very limited tournament data and they will run far too far with it. They will take it far too seriously and put more weight onto a limited sample size than they realistically should. And that's just because people are looking for quick and easy answers to difficult questions. And in this case, you have all the people who made it into the top 8. They made it here by bringing 3 decks. And for the most part, there's some people who brought some weird stuff. But for the most part, they brought pretty straightforward deck lists. Like, a lot of people brought, like, Soviet Italy control, Germany, France, and Jagro. And now they suddenly have to bring a 4th deck, and they have to go into, well, what is the best 4th deck? Because not a lot of people brought US, not a lot of people brought Britain. And the people who brought Britain did not do particularly well. And the people who brought US, for the most part, didn't do particularly well, except for USA, France, Heavy Throp, which had a 100% qualification rate.
Yep.
Now, you can also interpret that exact same data as 2 people qualified with the only 2 US Throp decks, and might not have ever played the deck. We don't know. But you're getting a lot of players who they need to find a 4th deck, and they are a bit lost. There's no clear best Britain deck out of the data. Like, if you are getting what is the best deck exclusively off of the data from the qualifiers, USA France does appear to be exclusively from the data from the qualifiers the best deck you can bring as the 4th deck in your lineup, and that seems to be what everybody, for the most part, or at least 6 of these players, decided, or 4 players, I should say, have switched over to running Throp, or who did not previously run it. And that is, again, putting just far too much weight into a very limited data from the Swiss round. 5 rounds of best of 3, no bans. It's a bit of a mess, I think. And this is why I warned earlier that people watching this video should, again, like, take all of these stats with a grain of salt, because this is one tournament, and just because a deck qualifies with an 100% success rate does not mean that that deck is an excellent deck. Again, they could have not even played it, or they could have played it 2 or 3 times between them and just gotten fortunate matchups or gotten fortunate draws. That's a very small sample size. And if you think about it, like, did like any given deck draw well like 2 or 3 games in a row? And it's like, well, yeah, sure, that doesn't mean that the deck's good, but we just put so much weight on it that it's like, oh, look at these like fancy numbers and like the score chart and the win rates, and it's tournament players who qualified for this and money's on the line, and all of that adds extra weight on what is still a very small sample size. But I think the people who are bringing Throp, because everybody brought it, it kind of cancels it out, where I don't think, like, I just think there's better things people could have done for the 4th deck than Throp, but nobody seems to have particularly been doing that. So, if everybody brings Throp, then it's like nobody brought Throp. And then nobody's really getting punished for it, which then actually might perpetuate people thinking Throp is better than it actually is into the next tournament. But the next tournament's going to be after a summer expansion, if my understanding is correct. So by that point, probably be hit by a balance change and a bunch of new cards. So that might not end up mattering. And that's sort of the interesting thing about these expansion tournaments, where you only have one expansion or one tournament per meta, is that tournament does not necessarily represent what the meta is. Because, somebody a year from now might be looking back on this deck meta or this tournament lineup and be like, oh, this is the top 8 for the United Front meta. Man, Throb must have been like a really popular, powerful deck on ladder. And it's, oh, no, it's not. It's relatively popular, but it's the deck that I think the people who are grinding for points on ladder, they queue into it and they're like, oh, yeah, I got a free win. But again, this is small sample size, but that's me rambling a bit too much about Throb here.
To be fair, it was inevitable that there was always going to be some talking point that was going to take us both into that place. And this happens to be that one. But yeah, I think what's interesting is that we get the summary. So this is the point at which I'm going to, I'm going to effectively cross the line with this. If you want to find out more about reads on tournaments and stuff like that, there'll be plenty of that coming over the weekend. Catch the Cards Twitch, because everything will be broadcast. There'll be some top class casters who will be talking about that tournament. This is probably going to release after the tournament, so I'm not going to start. I mean, I might spicily at the end just see if I can poke JKing for his predictions for the tournaments, but because I can timestamp this with when it was recorded, and we can see how prophetic you want to be. But I'm going to bring it back now that we've kind of covered all of these different things and the way that people's minds work, to kind of the main thrust of this video, which is, to what extent do we feel tournaments influence meta? To what extent do we think that tournaments can be used as a good meta read? And how much value do these lists that we can kind of quickly copy and paste nowadays into our client give us? Now, I'm going to save my opinions for the end, because that's my privilege, it's my channel, but also I'm here as much as anyone else to get different takes on it. My take is probably going to be very different than the one you're about to hear, because my take is based on players whose aim is to get into the game, get a decent collection, regularly hit Field Marshal, and not worry too much about top-end stuff. But this is my thing. There's the questions for you. To what extent do we read meta from this? How influential are these tournaments on meta, and if they are, why?
I think so. There's a lot to unpack here. So this might be a little all over the place, but starting off, I don't think that tournaments, the decks being brought to tournaments, necessarily represent the meta. Those are two very distinct things, because there is tournament meta and then there is ladder meta. Those are two very different things. And generally speaking, I don't actually find that tournament meta influences ladder meta too much. Now, it's sort of feast or famine in when it does. So sometimes you'll have, for example, a few tournaments ago, back when we were still running with OCCs, people were doing all sorts of different things, and then Henry showed up to a tournament with 3 mill lists and won the tournament with 3 mill lists, took everybody by surprise, took the tournament by storm, and Mill did not really see any uptick in popularity on ladder whatsoever. And nobody brought Mill to the next tournament either. It was just sort of like a flash in the pan, sometimes that happens. But other times, you'll have somebody bring a deck to a tournament that performs very well, and catches people by surprise. And then next thing you know, everybody's played it on ladder. I can't think of any timely examples off the top of my head, and any recent examples per se. But it can influence it, but they are two distinct things, and they are never one for one. And you can't say everybody brought Throb to this tournament, everyone's going to start playing Throb on ladder. There might be a temporary small uptick, but if people aren't finding that win rate, generally speaking, people go back to what they were playing before. And also generally, ladder is going to skew more aggressive, because aggressive decks tend to be cheaper, and the games are much faster, and people like fast games, and there are a lot of people who don't have full collections and can't just build every deck at will. So it does sort of come to the question, though, of what defines the meta. Is the meta what is popular, or is the meta what is good? And obviously, it's a little bit of both, but how you find that exact middle ground in terms of what you're actually measuring is a very interesting question. So, just for example, the ramp's been quite strong recently, but for years and years and years, ramp was always like relatively popular on ladder, and for about a year, before we got Bomber Mafia, ramp saw a big uptick in popularity and was like honestly like probably the most popular deck on ladder that you would see just played ladder throughout month after month. But nobody ever brought it to tournament. It had an abysmal win rate, and it was absolute trash. But do you say that that ramp deck was part of the meta for those various expansions, those years? Maybe, maybe not. And then on the other hand, on the flip side, you and I both agree that we think Soviet Britain Control is the best way to build Soviet Control and is one of the best decks in the game. Full stop. Almost nobody plays it. Is that deck meta, or is that part of the meta? When you're talking about meta, there's a lot of very tricky things to define. And I think I view tournament meta and ladder meta as two very distinct things that they both influence each other. It is a two-way street in influence. You see a lot of people bring a deck to a tournament because it performs great on ladder, and it performs abysmally in tournament. And vice versa, you see a lot of people take tournament decks onto ladder and then they perform abysmally with them because they were created and curated for a very specific tournament meta. They're very different formats of playing the game. But for the most part, they are two distinct things, and I think that is because the tournament meta is a very, very small thing with a very niche group of players, and those players will not be representing a more holistic player base, and it's very easy for trends to make their way into, or just like sort of patterns in thinking to make their way into a very small player base and stick around longer than they necessarily should. Whereas the player base as a whole is going to be influenced by a lot of things other than just what's the best win rate. It's going to be influenced by how much time do I want to playing cards, how many cards do I have, what the skill cap on this deck is, how much time am I willing to put in to practice this deck for like a satisfactory win rate, how much do I care about just enjoying myself playing the game as opposed to winning, because enjoying yourself and winning are not necessarily one and the same when you're playing a card game. So there's a lot of factors that go into both things. So I didn't really have like a specific answer, but that's a random way of detailing some of my thoughts. If there's any thing that you want to dig in or want me to dig in a bit deeper into, feel free to ask follow-up questions. But that's my general thoughts.
Yeah, I
on
think
the meta.
I think it's fair to say that I don't. If you're expecting either of us to just give you the babbing, kind of quick cut politics answer to all of this stuff, you're probably going to be bitterly disappointed, because I think we've both been around long enough to have learned that meta is one of those words that honestly at times bugs the hell out of me, because it is the hardest thing in any competitive environment to define, and it becomes even harder to define when it is multiple environments, and cards is a multiple environment competitive game. At the minute, for me, one of the most frustrating parts is that it's gone from being like binary to trinary, if that's even a word, because it used to be that you had ladder meta and tournament meta, but now you've got generic ladder meta, in-game tournament ladder meta, and the two, having played a chunk of both, don't look the same because they're very different things. And then at the end of it, you've got, from everyone who then qualifies, what we define as a tournament meta. And I think the thing we can take, and especially if you're a newer player, one of the things that you can definitely take from this sort of discussion and analysis of tournaments is to get a good idea of what are really good cards right now and cards that are particularly worthwhile. I've often said to people, pay attention particularly to all of the limited and standard cards that you see being repeated across decks. Those are probably cards you want in your collection. At the moment, by the way, particularly if they're German or French. Just saying. But at the same time, you can clip a lot of these decks, throw them on ladder or into an in-game tournament, and you won't necessarily do well. What I do think JKing gave, and I'd rather not dig into it too much because I think that answer speaks more than digging into it ever can, is being able to articulate the complexity of reading a meta. Even more so now for me, and again, JKing will get right of reply in a minute, but I think we agree on this one. This new format of expansion tournaments has created an even greater narrowing of the likelihood that tournament decks and play can have any real lasting impact on a meta, because by the time you get to the next tournament, most of it's been blown out of the water, because the card pool's going to have changed. Balance changes are going to have hit. And on the one hand, I think that's going to make for a much more varied and occasionally perhaps entertaining, as long as some care is taken with curating the cards, experience on ladder and getting up to Field Marshal. But it's also going to create some very, very interesting tournament metas where you're either going to, in my opinion, see everyone leaning hard into the things they know just fundamentally work because there's not enough time to innovate because we're adapting to a new meta, or occasionally someone is just going to do something mad, crazy and wild, cook something that somehow just grips on and works, and that's going to then spring forward and be part of it. And none of that is necessarily going to translate to how you qualify. One example I will give, and I think it moots understanding, is that right now the qualification methods for this tournament, for me, aren't equal enough to build a good meta either. I am a very open proponent of doing something about the way that in-game tournaments lead to qualification. I've made suggestions about this, I've talked privately and publicly about this. I do not like that you can just get a sheer weight of numbers push to qualify as one of the top 8 people who have played in in-game tournaments before any season. And the reason, by the way, if anyone's wondering what on earth I'm talking about, what you have to understand is on ladder there is a penalty for losing. If you lose a game, if I run into JKing on ladder and we play and we're both at our best, we'll probably both see a little shift on our elo and we'll jump a bit or drop a bit. If I run into, I don't know, Frida von Fredriksson, who's hit Field Marshal this season for the first time but has gotten onto a really good deck and is rolling, and they get a good matchup and blow me out of the water, my elo plummets and I drop hard. Because there is a gain for winning and a loss for losing. If I play 700 tournaments, because somehow I have the gold to do it, and win 300 of them, having lost more than half of them, I get to go to the tournament. Because there is no penalty for me losing other than having to spend stuff. Now, it can be seen as a rant, but I think it impacts the conversation we're having about the difference between ladder meta. Ladder meta is always going to lean towards a certain degree of consistency and good matchup finding and comfortability on a deck. Tournament meta kind of wants consistency, but it also wants hard win rate, but it doesn't need a high win rate, it needs a volume win rate. And that, for me, if we want to keep competition alive in this game in a new form, and I have no problem with the fact that competition has to evolve and change, but if we want to keep it comfortable and alive, we maybe need to look at that. But anyway, that's kind of my take on the way that tournament impacts meta in a negative way, in my opinion, because you will see more and more people feeling pushed out of, say, an Iron tournament, because the only people who are constantly playing are the people who want to qualify to compete. And that means a lot of people are going to be like, oh, I've saved up my gold or whatever, and I want to have a go at this with a deck that I think I'm... And you're just going to get hammered. Because that's how it's working right now. Now, I'm going to... Again, I said I'd give him right of reply. I don't know whether he agrees or disagrees, because this is a subject we haven't talked about. But I'll let JKing speak for a bit.
Yeah, so I have three things three different, fairly different things that I want to say about three kind of different topics. So I'll start with the one that's going to be applicable to newer players, and that is, what is the value of, like, where should you go for decks and help as a newer player who wants to build like their first competitive deck? Should you go to tournament deck lists and copy like the decks of the guy who won the most recent tournament? Short answer is no. I think copying tournament decks, and you touched on this as well, but like there's so much that goes into a tournament deck beyond just like, this is a very good deck. And obviously, if you were like a newer player who just wants a fun deck that's going to have a decent win rate, then that's fine. But if you want to get into tournaments yourself, then definitely don't do that. And especially if you can only build part of the deck, ask for help. Because there are some decks where you can build, like, you can put in 30 of the 40 cards and then put in 10 free-to-play versions of other cards, and you'll have a small drop in the win rate. And there are some decks where if you don't have almost card for card, or at least the specials and elites, the deck's just going to fall apart and be useless. And as well as there are some cards that might look very popular, but like they require other key cards that you don't have to be good. So at the end of the day, if you are looking for a good deck, just ask somebody who is experienced, and they will tell you, like, these are the safe cards to craft. Like, this is probably like the deck to best go for in terms of just what's going to be easiest to craft. Also, tournaments will often obfuscate a lot of very good decks. So, for example, Germany-France is clearly the best German deck you can play, but there might be an incredibly good, incredibly cheap German deck that does not see any play in tournament because it is slightly worse than Germany-France with similar matchups. And that's just a deck you'll never see in a tournament, but if you ask someone, they can help you. So if you are newer to the game or looking to get into the game more seriously, always ask someone. Don't just copy a list you've never seen before, because there's a high chance that that's not going to work out. Now, going back to what you were talking about and the qualification tournament, or the qualification methods to the tournament, I don't disagree that I have issues with tournament mode being a method of qualification. I think it is a little gatekeepy because not everybody has the resources to play it like in the maximum number of Iron tournaments every single time an Iron tournament is open, and that is kind of necessary. Whereas anybody on like a brand new account, you can play ladder as much as you want, and you can try to get as high on ladder as you want, free of charge. Whereas tournaments, like, it's going to heavily favor the people who have been playing this game for years and years and years and have huge stockpiles of gold to perpetually play at Iron tournaments. So I don't like it for that aspect. The one thing that I would push back, and again, this isn't me disagreed that this is a critique, it's more that I think is a critique you could apply to both things, and that is it heavily favors people who put in more time, because it is a direct expression of how much time you have put in with no penalties for losing. And ladder does have a penalty for losing, but sometimes you will have a player qualify in the top 8 or the top 16 or the top 12 or whatever format it is. You'll have a player qualify off of ladder, and they will do it with like a 60% win rate, but with like 1,400 games. And what happened is they just played at a very low win rate, but they played like 8 hours a day, every day for 3 weeks. And at some point, they hit a very lucky, like, 25-game win streak, or like they went like 50-2, which is just a massive statistical anomaly in their actual win rate. But it put them up to a point where they could stop playing before, it evens out and they drop down below, substantially lower to what their normal expected peak elo is. And like basically my point is I think ladder also drastically benefits people who play more games, because there's no elo decay, so it's not about what your win rate is, it's about what is the highest peak you ever reached, and if you just play constantly, you will eventually hit a statistical anomaly and hit a peak much higher than your baseline average is going to be. But that's just an additional critique of the qualification method that I would have as someone who's been played in a variety of different qualification methods for a long time. And then the last thing I will say is it's a bit esoteric. It's a little bit out there, but you sort of led me to this thought, which is, does tournament meta exist anymore in cards? And that could be like a video by itself, so I'm not going to get too far into it. But with the current format of tournaments, where there's a tournament every 3 months in a brand new meta, there's been 1 or 2 balance patches and a new release of cards between each tournament, it genuinely leads to the question of, does the tournament meta exist? Because if you have one tournament, is it really a meta of just like what did people bring? Because I feel like an aspect of meta is it has to be over a period of time. And that is something that we don't get in the current format. And I don't think it's really fair to say like we have a tournament meta anymore, because previously when you have like monthly tournaments and sometimes several tournaments a month, you would have people like they'd bring this deck and then they'd see that this deck was popular, so they bring this deck to counter, like they bring deck B to counter deck A, and then deck B gets refined, and then deck B becomes the new top dog, and deck A falls off the map, and because of that, deck B's win rate drops, and that allows deck C, which was being held back by deck A, to come. And like you have all this evolving choices in what decks people are bringing to successive tournaments, whereas now people just bring random crap, and it works or it doesn't work, and then we don't have a tournament for 3 months, and then it's a new sets of decks and new cards and whatnot. There's no opportunity for people to figure things out and test and improve and build and evolve on what came before, and I feel like that's a crucial part of meta. And I think a personal example of this is the first expansion tournament we've had. Obviously, the second expansion tournament's been played in less than 24 hours, but hasn't been played yet. The first expansion meta we saw, ladder was mainly control. It was a very control-heavy ladder. And then we expected control in the Swiss round. And in the Swiss round, everybody bought just hyper-aggressive decks, and the entire Swiss round was over in like 2 hours. And it was like, wow, this came out of nowhere. Maybe there's a read. Maybe hyper aggro is sort of the future, and they've countered the control decks, and then top 8, everybody just went back to control. Like, people just played random decks, essentially. There was no pattern. You could try to figure out individual players' reasoning, like we've been doing with why people suddenly switched to Throp. But there's no opportunity for that to really evolve, and I feel like because of that, it is just sort of people bring random things and hope it works. And that's not to say that there's not a value in the skill and the effort being put in by the players. Obviously, I say random things to be funny, but like these players are putting a lot of thought into what decks they are bringing. But the thought is largely in a vacuum, or it's in a small testing group that is not based on information on previous tournaments at all. It is based on just very, very limited information. So I'm curious as to what you think about that thing. But I'm not like hard say that that's my definitive opinion, but it's just launching the hypothetical of, do tournament metas even exist anymore in this format?
See, I love it when we do this, and this was part of my hope in these conversations, because generally speaking, even when they're not conversations that have anything to do with recording, if you and I have a conversation, it tends to go in its own direction. And I mean, part of the reason I made the point was to see if I could provoke more or less exactly that response, which is, I've been on this since kind of just about midway through watching the last expansion tournament, wondering is tournament life now just more like pocket metas that you see on ladder, where it's just the thing that's working at the time is the thing that's working in the time, and you do the best you can. Like, you do not, like, I will take not a stick away from the quality of these players, because I know they're going to have spent hours planning and refining and doing the best they can with their lineups. But they are, as you say, they're doing it in kind of this little glass bowl of the now, and it's not going to have lasting value, because it's not like next month we do it all over again and you get to refine on the idea you've had. You get to then go back to the grind to qualify, and I've done a video on the grind. It's serious, it is real. Notwithstanding people who do freakish things, Berto, I'm looking at you and your 80% win rate run that I watched you do, where it's like everybody else grinds their way in, and then you just turn up at the end of the season like, I won 80% on a few hundred games. Look, I'm in the... But really, that is not a normal experience. Even for the very best of us, even for legitimately the best player this game has ever seen. Can't argue with it, statistics are statistics. It's a grind if you want to do it. And that's not going to... You go back now, you kind of take your little glass bauble of this was the meta of the tournament I played in, and you can put it on a shelf. It doesn't really mean anything anymore, because now you're grinding until the rush into the next tournament where you're like, what feels like it's going to be good? Is that good or bad? I'm not going to say if that's good or bad. I'm going to say it's definitely different than the OCC era, where we saw monthly tournaments and that growing and evolving meta. I do think that, to a certain extent, the question of meta, not just in tournaments, but in general in cards at the minute, is very different than it was 8 months ago, 6 months ago, because we've changed the way that the indication functions. Because, like it or not, whether or not we would advise it, in the past I have seen a pattern of people at the very least paying a lot of attention to tournament play and decks to at least get an idea of what might be good. And that has bled into ladder, but on smaller ones, and it's particularly bled into the Field Marshal climb, and I've had to correct or advise a lot of newer players on how to do exactly what JKing, or undo exactly what JKing warned about not doing, which is taking a deck that has a very specific set of moving parts, going, this looks amazing, but I haven't got this, and I don't have this, but this is about right, and this is about right, and then going, but it doesn't work. And it's like, yeah, unfortunately, you picked one of those decks where the moving parts are like the parts of a top-end quartz watch, that they are hand-tooled, and that cog is not the same as the other one. Like, one of these things is not like the other, and when you put it in there, the whole thing just stops working. But if you try this, it'll be more effective. Couldn't agree more. Ask questions. Join my Discord. Join JKing's Discord. Watch the videos that we try and put out. I am going to be trying to do more and more deck guides. For what I consider to be generically good decks, not tier 1 decks, not flash in the pan, this is fantastic decks. It's one of the reasons I did the US France mid-range deck. That deck is never going to tier 1 itself, but it is perpetually, as long as the cards are still there, going to be able to get wins. Jagro falls into that category and then kind of climbs its way in. Maybe I should do a Jagro. God, maybe I should do a Jagro video, but I'm digressing. What I will say is that if you want your big takeaway from this video, it is enjoy the creators that are out there. We have a very positive community on the whole in cards. There are people you can ask who will help you. There is advice out there that can do it. And if you watch this video and your big thing was how on earth do I read the meta or understand it, I think that's going to be your best piece of advice. And I think particularly, and this is why I had on my notes, which he hasn't seen, the hope that we'd end up at this point. I think going forward, that's going to become even more important, because we are stepping away from the easy indicators, and I think those of us who are how to put it, outspoken and have access to a microphone are going to have to be good stewards of that microphone going forward, because more and more people are going to look at our videos and look to our streams for ideas and thoughts and questions. And that's a good thing, because it means we can interact. But it's also fascinating to see the change. I'm not going to let this drag on much longer. We're bordering on 3 hours of recording time, which means this is going to be a long one even after I've edited it. What I am going to do is thank JKing for being, one, a good friend and letting me do random crap like this and agreeing to give me an entire chunk of his day to make a random video, because I literally, if anyone's interested how this stuff happens, like, oh, is it this and that, and you've been planning for months? No, I just dropped him a Discord message a few days ago and went, would you be interested? I kind of think this might be a thing. And here we are. So, big support and thanks for that. It's been a genuine privilege taking this apart. I think there's a very serious possibility there are a bunch more videos to do. I did say, though, for those of you who stuck to the end, I promised you I'd do it. I am going to put you on the spot, because we have seen them. What's your read? And I'm going to ask for who you think's going to win it, and what you think the final might look like. Feel free to be extemporaneous, but I know everybody's going to want me to press the point on this.
I was not expecting the second part of that question. I haven't tried to look over the combined lists as to what I'd like in the moment. And I have it down into two players where I generally like their lineup. I don't think there's a lot separating. Like, the lineups here are very, very similar. And we've seen some tournaments where people are all over the place, worlds, so many different lineups. Here people have a lot of the same thing. There's not a ton differentiating people. So there's certain the covert deck. I don't think the covert deck is gonna be do well. So that's a point against Mule. I don't think Mule's winning this, unfortunately. But to separate other people, it's very similar. So I take this with a grain of salt. I think that there is not a lot separating these players on the deck list. I think it's going to come down to, does anyone make any crucial mistakes? And that, I'm not familiar with a lot of these players, so I can't say if they're going to crack under the pressure or not. But my favorites to win both come from the same side of the bracket. It is Hollow God and Top Chef, seeds 2 and 8. And mostly it's just because they don't have Throp. That's literally, they're the two players who didn't bring Throp. Now, who is going to meet them in the finals, who are on the other side of the bracket is going to rise up and meet them. They have very, very similar deck lists, the four of them. So I'm going to say Tweet Cargo just based on experience. I'm just going to say Tweet Cargo is going to meet them in the finals just because he's the one who is the most experienced of that group of 4 players. And if everyone has the same decks, experience is going to be the tiebreaker. So yeah, I'm calling it now. Tweet Cargo versus Top Chef finals, with Top Chef taking it.
Right, so we've got that on record. This will go out after the tournament has happened, so we'll know whether it's accurate. Because, I will give it a go, but there's no way I'm getting this video edited and out ahead of the tournament. But that's all good, because the point, again, of this video was not to just talk about tournament life and do predictions. That's just a bit of fun. As ever, I really hope people have found this useful and interesting. Please do let us know, though, if you have, because when it comes to collabs, we have transatlantic schedules to deal with. So these things, despite the fact that we do get on, don't happen super easily, but we do love doing them, and we do love people's interactions. Legitimately, It's always a privilege to have these conversations. I'm going to let JKing, before I do my sign-off, I'm going to let JKing do a quick sign-off himself, let you know kind of what he's up to, what to expect from him going on, and then I'll give my quick sign-off, and then we'll let you go after the many hours you have watched of us talking.
Yeah, all right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me onto this. I love talking about cards pretty much more than anything else. So, giving the opportunity to talk about cards for 3 hours and someone else is going to edit it, absolutely. Um, Now, what I have going on in the very short term, I will be casting the top 8, which this video will be coming out after that. So if you didn't watch it live, you can go back, and I will be one of the team of casters giving coverage for that tournament. So you can hear my thoughts on all of those decks. But if you want to follow me personally, you can go over to my channel. Where I upload a lot of videos. Recently, I've been sort of covering just sort of fun tier 2 decks that I've discovered to just give you different ideas of things to be playing on the ladder, but I also cover a lot of just competitive coverage, so just covering the best decks, the tier 1 decks, covering tournaments, that kind of stuff. So if you like to hear about sort of the top end gameplay, sort of what's going on in those circles, even if you're not in there yourself, absolutely go and check me out over there. And I also have a few content that's a bit more approachable to everybody, like tier list videos, and the occasional sort of newer player, free-to-play player type of content. All of that fun stuff is over on my YouTube, and I very occasionally stream, so, if you occasionally use Twitch, feel free to give me a follow, and maybe you'll see a notification next time I go live over there.
Yep, 100%. All the links down there. All the links to my stuff down there, as they always are. As ever, I love this community. I love this game. Like JKing, I could talk about this game for hours, and I just did. But, as always, take care of yourselves, be good human beings, and I/JKing will see you next time.